The night Seraphina Vale learned what she was worth, she was standing in the most beautiful room she had ever entered, and the man who swore to love her was announcing his engagement to someone else. Right in front of her, right in front of everyone. She didn't scream, she didn't beg. She stood there in ivory silk her sister had stitched by lamplight for 3 weeks straight, and she felt the floor tilt under her feet like the world itself had lost interest in holding her up. Stay with me until the end of this story. Drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. Because what happens next is going to change everything you thought you knew about power, rejection, and who gets the last word. The gala had been built to impress gods. Seraphina understood that the moment she stepped through the gilded archway of the Auric Dominion's Grand Meridian Hall and the heat of 500 candles hit her face like a fist wrapped in silk. The ceiling soared 4 stories above the marble floor, draped in silver banners stamped with the Dominion's moon crest, and beneath the chandeliers, each one a cascading explosion of crystal and cold light. Nobles moved like schools of expensive fish, their gowns and tunics and embroidered cloaks catching the illumination and throwing it back in fragments. It smelled of crushed flowers and beeswax, and the particular kind of ambition that lives inside people who've never once gone to bed hungry. She didn't belong here. She had known that before she arrived. She'd known it when she dressed in the small room her sister had rented for the night, 2 streets back from the Meridian's grand entrance, tucked above a tannery that leaked its sour stink through the floorboards. She'd known it when Alara pinned the last button at the back of her neck and pressed both palms flat against Seraphina's shoulder blades and said, "Steady now, steady," in the voice she used when steadiness cost something. But belonging and surviving were 2 entirely different negotiations, and Seraphina had spent 24 years learning the second one. She moved through the crowd with her chin level and her hands loose at her sides. The ivory gown moved with her, the hem whispering across the polished floor, and the fabric caught the candlelight in a way that Alara had planned deliberately. She'd sewn tiny glass beads into the underskirt, almost invisible, just enough to throw a shimmer when Seraphina walked. A small extravagance on a frontier woman's budget. A gift built entirely from stubbornness and love. Several nobles glanced as she passed. Most looked away again. A few didn't. She found a place near the east wall, not far from a column of pale stone veined with gold, and she stood there with a glass of cold wine she didn't intend to drink, and she watched the room the way she'd learned to watch every room she'd never been invited into, methodically, cataloging exits and faces and the invisible architecture of who mattered to whom. Lucien wasn't on the floor yet. That was fine. She could wait. She had been waiting for 3 years. The thought carried no bitterness when she turned it over. That surprised her sometimes, how thoroughly she had trained herself out of bitterness. Back in Vesmir, the frontier province where she'd grown up in a house that needed a new roof every winter and never got one, bitterness was a luxury. It took energy to maintain. It sat in your chest and ate at the fuel you needed for more useful things, like keeping the fire going and the younger kids fed and the landlord convinced that next month's payment was genuinely coming. She'd met Lucien 3 years ago when he came through the frontier on what the court called a progress tour, and what the frontier called a reminder that they existed within the Dominion's borders rather than beside them. He'd ridden into Vesmir on a pale horse with an escort of 20 men, and he'd looked like everything the capital had ever promised the provinces and never delivered. Tall, sharp-featured, wearing a coat that cost more than her family's house. She'd been on the roof of the grain warehouse, patching a leak, when he looked up and saw her. She had not climbed down because he looked up. She climbed down when the patch was finished. He'd sought her out afterward, said she was the most honest person he'd seen in 3 weeks of travel, said the frontier had given her something the court couldn't manufacture, said eventually, standing by the river at dusk with the water going copper in the failing light, "I want you beside me when I'm crowned. I want someone who hasn't been built by the palace. I want you." She'd told him it wasn't a promise she could collect on. He'd said, "Then let me make it a vow." She should have known, she supposed, that vows made at riverbanks by men on horseback tended to dissolve when those men returned to places with ceilings and politics and mothers with ambitions of their own. She hadn't known, or she'd known and chosen not to apply the knowledge. Either way, she was here now, in the room, wearing borrowed glass beads, waiting. Across the hall, a pair of doors opened and the herald's voice rose above the crowd noise with the particular trained projection that cost years of practice to achieve. Crown Heir Lucien Voss, and Lady Isabeau Aldrich, daughter of Grand Duke Harlan Aldrich of the Northern Reach. The crowd shifted. Bodies turned. Seraphina turned with them. Lucien walked in wearing gold. Of course he wore gold. His family's color, his dynasty's color, the color of every expensive thing the Dominion used to remind itself of its own importance. He was handsome in the way that power made men handsome, which was different from actual physical beauty and involved mostly the way he held himself. Like every room he entered had been arranged to receive him. The woman beside him was striking, dark hair, pale skin, a gown the color of deep water. She moved the way women moved when they'd been trained from childhood to move through rooms like this one, which was smooth and deliberate and slightly too precise to be entirely natural. Seraphina watched them cross the floor. She watched people turn to greet them, watched hands extended and cheeks offered and heads inclined, watched the particular theater of a court arranging itself around its central gravity. She watched Lucien's eyes sweep the room and find her. He didn't stop walking, he didn't falter, but something in his face, some small tightening, some brief recalibration, told her he had not forgotten she would be here tonight. He had simply decided something about that fact and reached whatever conclusion he'd reached, and now he was walking forward with Isabeau Aldrich on his arm and his jaw set in the particular way of a man who has already made a decision and doesn't intend to discuss it. She stood very still. She was good at standing still. The herald climbed the 3 steps to the announcement platform at the hall's center, and the crowd quieted with the trained reflex of people accustomed to paying attention when attention was required. And Lucien climbed those steps too, drawing Isabeau with him, and Seraphina felt the first real thing she'd felt since walking into this room. Not fear, not quite, but something underneath fear. The cold foundation that fear gets built on. She knew what was coming. Some part of her had known since the herald called both their names. People of the Auric Dominion, Lucien's voice rang out, practiced and resonant and carrying the particular confidence of a man who has never once had to raise his voice to make people listen. Tonight, as this empire stands beneath the moon ascension, I am honored to announce the formal claim I have made before the Crown Council. Lady Isabeau Aldrich has agreed to stand beside me as the future queen of this dominion. Our union will secure the alliance between the capital and the Northern Reach, and strengthen the foundations of everything our ancestors built. The hall erupted in exactly the kind of applause that sounds like approval but functions like instruction. Seraphina did not move. She thought, with strange clinical clarity, that she could feel the glass beads in her hem. Alara had sewn them in by hand, one at a time, pulling thread through tiny holes with a needle so fine it bent under pressure. She'd done it over 3 evenings, hunched at the small table near the window, squinting at the work in the lamplight, pausing sometimes to press the heel of her hand against her lower back. She thought, Alara made this dress for tonight. She thought, I am not going to cry in this room. Lucien's gaze found her again across the crowd. This time it held for a breath longer, just long enough to constitute acknowledgement, not long enough to constitute apology. And then it moved on. Around her, people were turning, not to Lucien anymore, to her. She was not hard to find. She was the woman in ivory standing alone near the east column, the woman from the frontier provinces, the woman that enough people in this room knew about that the whisper was already moving through the crowd like a fast fire through dry grass. That's her. That's the one he promised. That's the girl from Vestmere. She could hear it without hearing specific words. She'd spent enough of her life in rooms where she was an object of discussion to recognize the sound of it. A woman nearby, older, wearing a collar of garnets, an expression of practiced sympathy that didn't reach her eyes, said, in a voice pitched slightly too loud to be private, "Poor creature, she actually came." Seraphina turned her head and looked at the woman directly. The woman looked away first. That was something. She set her wine glass on the nearest surface, a narrow ledge of the column she'd been standing beside, and she straightened her spine and she began to walk. Not running, not hurrying, walking with the same steady economy of movement she'd used to cross the hall 20 minutes ago, because she was not going to give this room a different version of her departure than the one she'd chosen. She was almost to the archway. She was almost out. 3 men stepped into her path. She stopped, not because they moved aggressively, not because they raised their hands or their voices or did anything that would read as threat in the conventional sense. They simply appeared, materialized between her and the exit with the particular quiet certainty of men who had never once in their lives needed to assert their right to stand anywhere. They were dressed in black, all three of them. In a room full of imperial gold and diplomatic color, they wore black like a considered choice rather than a lack of imagination. The fabric was fine. She wasn't foolish enough to miss that, but it was severe, unornamented except for a crest she half recognized at the breast of the tallest man's coat. House Ravaryn, Southern Empire. The knowledge settled into her stomach like a dropped stone. She knew the name. Everyone in the Auric Dominion knew the name, the way you knew the names of severe weather events and geological features that could end your crops. The Ravaryn dynasty ruled the Southern Empire with a combination of military power, economic leverage, and the particular kind of ancient legitimacy that made other dynasties treat carefully in their presence. They had been allies of the Auric Dominion for 2 generations. They had also been the reason 3 border wars ended without destroying both sides, because the Ravaryns had a way of making the cost of continued conflict feel more immediate than the cost of negotiation. The tallest man, she put him at 35 or so, dark hair, a face that had been in wind and weather and hadn't been softened by the absence of those things, was looking at her with an expression she didn't immediately have a word for. Not pity, not interest of the calculating kind. Something more like recognition, which made no sense, because she had never seen this man in her life. "You're leaving," he said. His voice was even, not a question exactly, more like an observation offered as an opening. "Yes," she said, "that would be a mistake." She looked at him steadily. "With respect, my lord, this is not your evening to manage." "No," he said, "but it might be yours." The man to his left, younger by a few years, lighter in coloring, with the kind of controlled stillness that read as tactical rather than natural, glanced briefly at his brother and then back to her. "You walked across that floor," he said, "after what just happened, without breaking stride. That's not a small thing." "Walking is not a performance," she said. "It's just walking." He almost smiled. It didn't quite arrive. That's what makes it a performance. The third man, positioned slightly back from the other two, broader, with a scar along his jaw that was old enough to be faded but distinct enough that it must have been significant at the time, said nothing. He was simply present in the way that people are present when they've learned that presence itself is a form of argument. She knew she should step around them. She knew she should excuse herself with the cold politeness available to women who are finished with a room and not interested in explaining why. Every practical instinct she'd developed over 24 years was suggesting the same course of action, and every one of those practical instincts had been sharpened on exactly this kind of situation, on the understanding that powerful men were most dangerous, not when they were hostile, but when they were interested. But she was tired, not in the way that sleep fixes, in the way that accumulates. "What do you want?" she asked. The tallest man, King Cassian, she was almost certain now, she'd heard descriptions, held her gaze with the focus of someone who was accustomed to people looking away from that gaze before he was ready to release them. "I want to know," he said, "if you understand what you're worth." The words landed differently than she expected them to. Not as flattery, not as the opening gambit of something she'd have to spend the next hour deflecting. As a genuine question, with the weight of a genuine question, and underneath the weight she felt something shift. Not in the room, not in the crowd noise that had gone lower and more attentive behind her, but in her own chest, where the thing that wasn't quite fear still lived. "That's a strange question for a stranger," she said. "It is," he agreed. "I'm asking it anyway." Before she could answer, a new voice cut across the space between them, familiar, controlled, carrying the specific sharpness of a man who has just realized something is happening without him. "Seraphina." She turned. Lucian had come down from the platform. He was moving toward them through the crowd, and people were peeling aside for him the way they did for men with his title and his particular expression, which was the expression of someone who has decided that an inconvenience is occurring and intends to stop it. His eyes went from her to the 3 men behind her and back. Something complicated crossed his face. "I didn't realize you were—" He stopped. "I wasn't aware you were acquainted with House Ravaryn." "She isn't," said Cassian. "We're in the process of changing that." Lucian's jaw moved. She is a guest of this empire's court. Her social engagements are her own business, Seraphina said. Both men looked at her. She had not planned to say that. She had not planned anything past making it through the archway and down the street and back to the room above the tannery where Alara would be waiting with tea and the particular silence of a sister who already knows what happened and isn't going to make you explain it until you're ready. But she was still here, in this room, in the dress with the glass beads, and the man who had made a vow by a copper river 3 years ago was standing in front of her in gold with his new fiancée 20 feet away, and he was looking at her with the expression of someone who had not anticipated that discarding something would make other people want it. Some fundamental truth clarified inside her in that moment, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the irreversible quality of a bone snapping. Something about how much space she had made inside herself over 3 years for a version of this night that was not this version. How carefully she had maintained that space. How thoroughly she had been willing to arrive here in this room, across this distance, in this dress, for a future that had just been publicly canceled in front of 500 witnesses. And on the other side of that clarity, something else. The Ravaryn King had not moved. He stood with the same steady patience he'd had when she first stopped walking, and he was watching her the way she sometimes watched injured animals she found in the fields outside Vestmere, not with pity, but with the practical attention of someone waiting to see what the animal would decide to do with the information of its own survival. "You said it would be a mistake," she said to him, quietly enough that it didn't carry past the immediate group. "To leave." "Yes," he said. "Why?" "Because what just happened to you happened in front of everyone in this room," he said, "and how you choose to respond in the next 10 minutes will determine what everyone in this room decides to believe about who you are for the next 10 years. You can leave now and be the woman he abandoned, or you can stay and be something else." Lucian made a sharp sound. "This is... Seraphina, you don't know these men. Whatever they've told you, yeah." "They haven't told me anything," she said. "We've been talking for about 2 minutes." "Then you have no reason to..." "I have no reason to stay," she said. "I had no reason to come either. I came because I believed something. That was my choice. Leaving is also my choice." She paused. "You don't get to weigh in on my choices anymore, Lucian. You made that clear 10 minutes ago in front of everyone." The silence that followed was not actually silent. The crowd around them had thinned into a specific radius of attentive space, and in the broader hall the music had softened and the chatter had gone low and focused, and she could feel the attention of the room like a physical pressure against her back. Lucian's face went through several things in fast succession. She watched him calculate. She had always been able to see him calculate. It was one of the things she'd respected about him once, the visible intelligence of it, the way he processed information without pretending he wasn't processing it. What she was watching him calculate now was how much damage control this required. Whether her staying was a greater problem than her leaving. Whether the Ravaryn interest was genuine or tactical. Whether he could afford to make this worse in a room full of people who were already making notes. "Seraphina," he said, and his voice dropped into a register she recognized, the one he'd used at the river, low and sincere, the register she'd trusted for 3 years. "I should have spoken to you before tonight. I know that. What happened was, it lacked the consideration you deserved. I am sorry for that." It was, she thought, a very good apology for everything except the actual thing. "You're apologizing for the method," she said, "not the decision." He held her gaze. "The decision was necessary." "Yes," she said. "I know it was." She felt something unexpected move through her then. Not forgiveness, not the particular relief of anger draining away, but something quieter and stranger, a species of understanding. "You were always going to choose what served the Dominion. I knew that. I just..." She stopped, looked at the floor for 1 second, looked back up. "I thought I served the Dominion too." That landed. She could see it land. "You did," he said. "You do. That's not..." "It's fine," she said. "Seraphina." "I said it's fine, Lucienne." She held his gaze for a moment longer. "Congratulations on your engagement. I mean that honestly. I hope Lady Aldrich is everything you need her to be." She turned back to the 3 men in black. King Cassian Ravaryn was watching her with the same expression he'd had from the beginning. and up close she could see things she hadn't noticed from the first look. The lines around his eyes that came from sun, not age, and the very slight damage to his left hand, old breaks healed imprecise. The kind of damage that came from fighting with your hands rather than directing other people to fight with theirs. "You were going to tell me what I'm worth," she said. "I was going to ask if you knew," he said. "I'm less certain it's a question you need answered." "What do I need then?" He considered her for a moment, genuinely considered, not performing consideration but actually doing it, which was different and visibly different if you knew what to look for. "Someone willing to see you accurately," he said, not charitably, accurately. Behind her, she heard Lucien take a breath, the specific breath of a man about to say something that will make the situation more complicated, and then she heard a different voice, a court official probably, urgent and low, and the sound of Lucien's attention being redirected, and then the soft withdrawal of his presence from the immediate space. "Your name," said the younger of the three men. Prince Orion, she was assembling now, master strategist, she'd heard that too. "I know what people are calling you tonight, but I'd rather hear it from you." "Seraphina," she said. "Seraphina Vale." "Orion Ravaryn." He tilted his head toward the silent one. "Kael." And toward the king. "You already know him." "I know of him," she said. "There's a difference," Cassian said. "Yes," she said. "I'm aware." The music in the hall had shifted. Something slower now, more formal, the strings doing the work while the other instruments rested. And around them the crowd had resumed its motion, recirculating away from the small drama that had played out in the space near the east column. People found other things to look at. Not all of them, but enough. She was aware in the back of her mind that this was not over, that the evening had generated something that the court would be talking about for weeks, regardless of what she did in the next hour, that she had become, without choosing it, the subject of a story that other people were already writing in their heads. What she had not expected was the particular quality of standing here, in this specific configuration, with these three specific men, and feeling, not safe, that would be foolish, but something adjacent to safe. Something that had the structural properties of being seen without being assessed for weakness. "There's a thing I want to say to you," Cassian said, "and I want to say it before whatever comes next, because what comes next is going to be complicated, and I would rather this particular thing not get lost in it." She waited. "I've been watching this empire for a long time," he said. "I've been in rooms like this one more times than I can count, and I've watched the way the court treats people it decides don't matter, and I've watched what that treatment does, to people who knew they didn't matter, and to people who thought they did." He paused. Not for effect, actually pausing. What you just did, what you said to him, wasn't something you learned in a place like this. You brought that in from somewhere harder. And the people in this room who dismiss you for being from the frontier are doing what small things do when they encounter something they don't recognize. They categorize it as lesser because they don't have the vocabulary for it. She looked at him. "That was a long way to say I respect you," she said. Something moved in his face that she thought might be the closest he got to open amusement. "It was." "Why?" she asked. "You don't know me. You saw me for 5 minutes across a hall." 10, said Orion. She glanced at him. "What?" "We arrived before you did," he said, with the precise neutrality of someone reporting a fact. "We were here when you came in. We watched you cross the floor." She processed this. "You were watching me before it happened," she said. "We were watching you," Cassian said. "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her steadily. The question she'd asked Orion, about the difference between knowing of someone and knowing them, turned in the air between them with a new weight she hadn't put there. "That," he said, "is a conversation for somewhere quieter than this." Across the hall, she saw Lucien in quiet, intense discussion with a cluster of court officials. She saw Lady Isabeau Aldrich standing nearby, composed and patient, with the expression of a woman who understood that the man she was marrying would always be in quiet, intense discussion with court officials, and had made a considered peace with this. She saw the herald's platform, empty now, the 3 steps still draped in their formal cloth. She saw the doors to the outer corridor. She saw the archway. She saw the exit she had been walking toward 10 minutes ago. Somewhere quieter, she said. There's a receiving room, Orion said. East wing, empty tonight. She thought about Alara, waiting above the tannery. Alara, who had sewn glass beads by lamplight for 3 evenings. Alara, who had pressed her palms flat against Seraphina's shoulder blades and said steady, now, steady. She thought, Alara would say to think. She thought, Alara would also say that thinking was not the same as standing still. All right, she said. She saw something shift in the balance of the 3 men. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone 10 feet away would have noticed, but a subtle redistribution of weight, a shared acknowledgement, and then Cassian stepped slightly to the side to make a path between himself and Kyle, and she walked through it, and they fell in around her, not closing, not surrounding, but present. And she thought, with the analytical part of her brain that had never learned to turn itself off, even when the rest of her was entirely elsewhere, that she was doing something she didn't fully understand yet. She thought, the evening that was supposed to change everything has changed everything, but not into anything I planned for. She thought, the floor has not stopped tilting. She thought, good. They had reached the corridor, and the noise of the gala was softening behind them when Cassian said, without looking at her, his voice pitched for the group and not for the hallway. There's something you should know before we reach the room. She kept walking. What? The Crown Council has already been petitioned, he said, in the last 20 minutes. She stopped. She turned. His face was neutral in the way that very controlled people wore neutral when they were carrying something serious. Petitioned for what? She said. Lucien filed a formal Dominion objection, Orion said. Not with satisfaction, simply with the flatness of a man reporting a complication he had anticipated. He's citing prior claim. He's demanding the council prohibit any formal approach to you from a foreign power. The corridor was quiet around them. Marble floors, high windows. Moonlight coming in cold and pale and indifferent. He discarded me an hour ago, she said. Yes, Cassian said, and now he's filing a claim. Yes, she looked at him. She looked at Orion. She looked at Kyle, who was still quiet, still positioned slightly back, watching the corridor behind them with the systematic attention of a man whose professional habit was identifying threats before they arrived. He doesn't want me, she said. He wants to own the question of what happens to me. Cassian held her gaze. Now you understand what you're up against. What we're up against, Orion corrected quietly. She felt the word we land in her chest like a hand pressed flat. Not Alara's hand, not the familiar pressure of someone who loved her and needed her safe. Something different, something that recognized her not as a person to be protected, but as a person to be stood beside. The council will rule, she said. Won't they? By morning, Cassian said. Possibly tonight. And if they rule in his favor? He didn't answer immediately, not because he didn't have an answer she understood, but because the answer was something he was deciding how to give her. Then, he said, we challenge the ruling. You do that, she said, for someone you've spoken to for 20 minutes. For someone I've been watching for considerably longer than that, he said. The 20 minutes is a recent development. The rest of it is not. The moonlight came through the high windows and lay in long, cold strips across the corridor floor. And somewhere back in the Grand Meridian Hall, the music was still playing, and the Empire was still celebrating the announcement of a future that did not include her, and she was standing in a quiet hallway with 3 men who scared her in a way that had nothing to do with danger, who scared her because they looked at her like she was something real, which was more frightening than dismissal, which she knew how to survive. You said, she started and stopped and started again. Back in the hall, you said there was something you'd seen before tonight. She looked at Cassian directly. What was it? His expression didn't change exactly, but something in it settled, like a frame coming to rest. Tell me your side of it first, he said. The frontier province. The uprising. She went very still. The uprising in Vestamir had happened 18 months ago. A tax collector and his armed escort, and a village that had run out of patience before it ran out of people. She'd been there. She'd done what she'd done. She hadn't talked about it after, because there hadn't been anyone worth talking about it with, and because the version of events she'd heard secondhand bore only loose resemblance to what she remembered. and she'd found it easier to let the story belong to its audience rather than fight to reclaim it. "How do you know about that?" she said. Cassian looked at her, and she understood suddenly the things she had not understood before. The recognition in his face when they first stopped her. The quality of the attention that had felt different from any attention she'd received in this building tonight. The precision with which he'd said, "accurate, not charitable." "You were there," she said. "Yes," he said. The corridor absorbed this. Her heart was doing something irregular in her chest. Not quite fear, not quite excitement, something that partook of both, and was fully neither. "You were in Vestmere," she said. "I travel without announcement when I can manage it," he said. "It gives me a cleaner view." "Of what?" "Of who people actually are," he said. "When they think no one important is watching." Behind them, far back through the marble corridor and the closed doors of the Grand Meridian Hall, she heard a sound she didn't immediately identify. Not music, not crowd noise, something sharper and more organized. A herald's voice, maybe. An announcement. Orion turned his head. His eyes moved with the swift calculation of a man who ran scenarios for a living. "They've moved quickly," he said. It was not a reassurance. "What is it?" Seraphina asked. Kael spoke for the first time. His voice was lower than his brother's, worn in at the edges, the voice of a man who used it sparingly and therefore precisely. "The council's convened. They're calling a formal session." "Tonight," she said. "Now," he said. Cassian looked at her. In the moonlit corridor, with the distant sound of an empire rearranging itself around a ruling she hadn't asked for, his face was steady in the way of something that has been tested enough times to know its own material. "Whatever they decide in that room," he said, "will not be the last word. I want you to understand that clearly." She looked back at him. 24 years of learning that institutions make decisions about your life and then stop returning your correspondence. 24 years of understanding that the powerful protect their decisions from revision by making the revision more expensive than the original error. 24 years of knowing, bone deep, that the difference between surviving and being broken by a system was almost always a question of what you were willing to cost it. "I understand," she said. "Good." He held her gaze one moment longer. "Then let's go hear what they've decided." They turned together, all four of them, toward the sound of the herald and the glow of the hall's open doors, and whatever the Crown Council of the Auric Dominion had decided to do with a woman who had come here tonight expecting one future and found something else entirely waiting. And as they walked, Seraphina felt the glass beads in her hem whisper against the marble, each small sound a record of her sister's hands in lamplight, of 3 evenings of careful work, of a love that had dressed her for a night that was not the night they'd planned for. The door to the Grand Meridian Hall opened ahead of them. The herald's voice carried through clearly now, sharp and formal and irreversible. "By order of the Crown Council, a formal right of sovereigns has been invoked." Seraphina felt the words hit her like cold water. The right of sovereigns, not a council ruling, not a diplomatic arbitration, an ancient contest, a public reckoning. The kind of formal combat that hadn't been invoked in living memory because the last time it had been, 3 houses had ended and 2 provinces had burned. To be conducted before the assembled kingdoms in response to the contested claim filed by Crown Heir Lucien Voss against the interests of House Ravaryn of the Southern Empire. The subject of contest. She heard her own name in the herald's voice. She heard 500 people absorb it. She heard, cutting through all of it, sharp and close and directed entirely at her, Cassian's voice saying 3 words so quietly they barely disturbed the air between them. "Don't look afraid." She looked at him. She looked at the open doors. She looked at the hall beyond, where the Empire was turning to face them, where Lucien was standing very still, where Lady Isabeau Aldrich wore an expression that was the first entirely unguarded thing Seraphina had seen on her face all evening, something between shock and what might have been pity, and where the herald was still speaking, still naming her, still pulling the shape of her future into something public and irrevocable, and utterly beyond what she had walked into this building expecting. "I'm not afraid," she said. And then, because it was true in the specific way that only the most complicated truths were true, because it sat alongside terror and uncertainty and the very real possibility that she had just walked into the center of something that could consume her, She stepped through the doors, into the light, into the hall, into whatever came next. The hall had not gone silent. That was the first thing she understood when she stepped through the doors. Silence was the absence of sound. What filled the Grand Meridian Hall was not silence. It was the sound of 500 people deciding, simultaneously, that the air had changed and that they needed to figure out what the new air meant before they breathed too much of it. The herald on the platform was still speaking. Vansam, the right of sovereigns, as codified in the Imperial Compact of the Third Age, requires that all parties present themselves before the assembled court within 1 hour of invocation. Failure to present constitutes forfeiture of claim. The Crown Council will convene. Seraphina walked into the center of it. She did not walk fast. She did not walk the way she'd walked when she was trying to leave. That had been a controlled retreat, economical and deliberate. This was different. She was not retreating. She was not advancing. She was simply occupying the floor with the same steady surety she'd used crossing the room earlier tonight, and she could feel the attention of the hall reorganize around her as she moved, the way iron filings reorganize around a magnet, and she thought, this is what Cassian meant, not about fear, about the story the room is writing about you. Every step she took right now was a sentence in that story. Cassian moved beside her, not in front of her, not slightly behind in the way that suggested ownership. Beside her, with the uncomplicated precision of a man who had decided where he would be and saw no reason to make it complicated. Orion and Kale spread slightly, one to each flank, and she felt rather than saw the change in the crowd's collective body language. The slight backward give of people who had just registered that the three men walking with the frontier woman in ivory were not courtiers, were not diplomatic escorts, were not the ceremonial attendants of a foreign delegation. They were something older than that, something the court's social architecture hadn't needed to accommodate in a long time. Lucian was waiting at the center of the floor. He had composed himself in the time since she'd last seen his face. The calculation she'd watched move through him was finished. He'd reached whatever position he was going to hold, and he was holding it now. And the position was, she could see, something in the range of controlled authority with an undercurrent of something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite wounded pride, but that drew from both sources. The problem with watching someone calculate for 3 years, she thought, is that you can read the results. Seraphina. He said her name with the weight of a man invoking something that belonged to him. What's happening right now is not what you think it is. Tell me what it is then, she said. The right isn't... I didn't file that petition for the reasons you're assuming. What reasons am I assuming? He looked at the three men beside her and his jaw tightened. I filed it to protect you. She had expected many things from him tonight. She had expected the announcement. She had expected the composure. She had expected the apology shaped like an apology, but built from the materials of self-justification. She had not expected this particular move, and she gave him a beat of credit for it. It was, in its way, audacious. To claim protection as the motive for invoking a military trial by combat on behalf of a woman he'd publicly discarded 40 minutes ago. You filed a claim of possession, she said, to protect me from men who haven't threatened me. You don't know them. I've been told that twice tonight, she said. It's starting to feel like an argument that functions in both directions. Something shifted in his face. Not breaking. She didn't think Lucian Voss broke easily. That was one of the things she'd respected about him. But adjusting, the way a man adjusts when he realizes the terrain is not configured the way he mapped it. The Ravaryn dynasty has its own interests, he said. Their interest in you is not, whatever they've suggested to you, it is not without motive. Every interest has a motive, Cassian said, from her right side. His voice was even, not raised, not with the sharpness of a man defending himself, more the flatness of a man who considers the accusation insufficiently serious to elevate. The question is whether the motive is honorable. You might consider that the bar for discussing honor is higher when you've spent the last 3 years making promises you intended to dissolve. The silence that followed was different from the hall's general noise that wasn't silence. This was a specific silence, localized, 3 feet wide, the silence of a man who has just been struck somewhere real. Lucian's eyes moved from Cassian to Seraphina. You told them. We have sources, Orion said pleasantly, that don't require her cooperation. This was, she realized, what the right actually was. Not a fight. Not yet. The fight was the formal portion, the ancient and documented portion, the part with rules and seconds and marble floors and the weight of 800 years of imperial precedent. This conversation at the center of the hall, in front of the assembled court, with the herald silent on his platform and the Crown Council watching from their elevated seats at the hall's far end, this was the argument before the argument, the part where positions got established, the part where everyone in the room decided what kind of story they were watching before the story declared itself. She understood, in a way she hadn't fully understood 15 minutes ago, what Cassian had meant in the corridor. The next 10 minutes, the story people would tell. She was not standing beside him because she trusted him. She was standing beside him because the alternative was standing alone. And she had come to the end of what she was willing to lose tonight in the service of standing alone. There was a philosophy to that choice she hadn't expected to arrive at before midnight. The hardest truth about survival, the one that took years to learn, and a specific quality of humiliation to teach, was that surviving alone required you to become smaller, not weaker, smaller, to take up less space, to need less, to want less, to metabolize disappointment so efficiently that you stopped generating the hope that produced it. She had been doing that for years. She had gotten very good at it, and she had walked into this hall tonight still doing it, still the version of herself that had learned to need only what could not be taken. What she was doing right now was different. What she was doing right now was taking up space she hadn't been given, and the room was watching to see what happened when she did. "I want to speak to the council," she said. The herald on the platform made a small sound, not quite surprised, but close to it. Lucien looked at her sharply. "You are not a party to this right. You're the subject of contest," she said. "Yes, I heard that. I would like to know if a subject of contest has standing to address the body that declared the contest." The herald consulted something. A document, a protocol, a memory she couldn't see from this distance. The Crown Council at the far end of the hall exchanged looks with the low-level intensity of people who have just encountered a procedural situation they hadn't anticipated. "The compact," said Orion, quietly and precisely, "grants the subject of any right the right of preliminary address. It hasn't been invoked because no subject in the last 400 years has thought to invoke it. It is, however, in the text." She looked at him. "I've read the compact," he said, with the simple factual neutrality of someone reporting that the sky was a known color. She turned back to the council. "I invoke the right of preliminary address," she said, loud enough to carry. She had grown up shouting over wind and through walls and across fields. She knew how to fill space with her voice without performing the filling. The eldest council member, a woman with white hair, and the expression of someone who has watched 20 years of politics and stopped being surprised by most of it, studied Seraphina for a moment with eyes that were doing a great deal of active work. "The right is granted," she said. "Approach." She walked toward this council, alone. She did not look back to see if the 3 Ravaryn men moved with her, because looking back was something you did when you weren't sure of your direction, and she was very sure of her direction, which was forward, which had always been forward. The council table was elevated on a shallow dais, 4 members in formal black trimmed with the Dominion's gold, their faces arranged in the careful neutrality of officials who considered their neutrality a professional asset. She stopped before them, and she stood the way she stood on roofs when the wind was bad. Weight distributed, spine straight, both feet planted with the intention of staying. "You've invoked the right of sovereigns on my behalf," she said. "I want to understand on what grounds." The eldest woman, Councillor Adrava, she remembered now, she'd heard the name in passing, leaned forward slightly. "The petition was filed by Crown Heir Voss citing prior claim. The involvement of a foreign power created a matter of imperial interest." "The involvement of a foreign power," Seraphina said, "meaning King Cassian Ravaryn approached me in a public hall after a public rejection and spoke to me for 20 minutes. The right is designed to resolve competing claims." "There is no competing claim," she said. Crown Heir Voss released his claim publicly, before everyone in this hall. He announced his engagement to another woman. Whatever he filed with this council afterward does not... She stopped, not because she'd lost her thread, but because she needed the pause to cost something, to be a deliberate pause rather than a reactionary one. does not change what he said from that platform 40 minutes ago. Silence from the council. Not uncomfortable, she considered. The compact, said a second council member, a younger man with careful eyes, does not distinguish between the sequence of actions. The filing stands irrespective of prior public statement. Then the compact is designed to allow a man to publicly discard a woman and then legally prevent other men from speaking to her, she said. That is what you're telling me. The careful-eyed man opened his mouth, closed it. Adrava said quietly, the right does not require your participation to proceed. It is a matter between the filing party and the respondent. Then what am I? She said. As the compact states, the subject of contest. An object, she said, with a right of address. The compact. I understand the compact, she said. I'm asking what I am in this room. To you. Right now. She held Adrava's gaze. Because I walked in here tonight as a person who made choices. And I would like to know at what point in the last 40 minutes I stopped being that. The hall behind her had gone to the specific quiet of a room that is paying close, collective attention without wanting to announce the fact. She could feel it on the back of her neck. Adrava studied her for a long moment. The kind of moment that has weight. The kind that women accumulate when they've spent decades in rooms full of men deciding things and have learned to use the weight of a moment rather than fight the moment itself. You retain the right to refuse the contest's outcome, Adrava said at last. The compact grants you that. It is rarely exercised, but it exists. I'd like to know more about that, Seraphina said. After, Adrava said firmly. The right proceeds first. All parties to the floor in 20 minutes. She was dismissed. She knew it and didn't contest it. She had gotten what she came for. Not an answer exactly, but the knowledge that there was something beyond the right that she could reach if she understood the mechanism. She turned from the council and walked back across the hall. Lucien intercepted her before she reached the three men. He stepped into her path with the particular bodily confidence of someone who has spent his entire life in rooms that accommodated his movement, and he kept his voice low, saying, not intimate, not the river at dusk voice, something more pressurized than that. What did you ask them? He said. Questions, she said. Seraphina. He put his hand on her arm. She looked at his hand. He removed it. Listen to me, he said. The right, what's going to happen tonight is going to follow you. However this resolves, your name is going to be attached to whatever happens on that floor. Whatever the Ravaryn brothers, your name is already attached to what happened on that platform, she said. My name is already attached to standing in this room afterward and not leaving. We're past the point where either of us gets to control what we're attached to. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. It took her a moment to identify it because it was so different from anything he'd worn in the hours she'd known him. It wasn't calculation. It wasn't the smooth surface of a man managing a room. It was, she thought, something close to actual desperation. I made a mistake, he said. Yes, she said. I am telling you I made a mistake. I heard you. That's not... He stopped. Started again. I'm not asking you to forget it. I'm asking you to consider that what's happening right now is moving faster than either of us intended, and there may still be a way to... To what? She said. Undo the announcement? Withdraw the petition? Put me back where I was an hour ago, which was standing by that column wondering when you were going to look at me. She paused. I'm not angry, Lucien. I want you to hear that clearly. I'm not standing here because I'm angry. I'm standing here because I made a decision, and I made it with the same clarity you used when you made yours. And that's the only version of this conversation I'm willing to have. He looked at her for a long moment. She saw him arrive, finally, at the understanding she'd reached 20 minutes ago in the corridor, that the terrain was not what he'd mapped, that the woman from Vestmere, who'd been a manageable political loose end, had become something the room was organizing itself around, that whatever he'd filed with the council had not achieved its intended effect, which was to put the situation back in a box. The Ravaryn king, he said. You know what he is. I know what you've told me he is, she said, which is that he's a threat. You've given me no specifics, only the label. He rules the Southern Empire with 300,000 soldiers. And you rule the Auric Dominion's future with 20 years of court positioning, she said. Power takes different forms. That's not an argument I find very useful from you tonight. She stepped around him. She walked back to where Cassian stood. He hadn't moved from the position he'd held while she was at the council table. Same posture, same stillness, with Orion to one side and Kyle slightly behind, and the three of them together had the quality of something deeply rooted, the kind of thing that doesn't shift because the wind picks up. "What did Adrava say?" Orion asked. "That I can refuse the outcome," she said, "after the right. That clause hasn't been invoked in 400 years. You know your history." "It's my job," he said simply. She looked at Cassian. "Tell me what happens on the floor." "Kyle goes first," he said, "against Voss. Combat is structured. First blood or submission, not killing. The compact doesn't allow killing in the right." "And after Kyle?" "Orion." "And after Orion?" He held her gaze. "Me. You fight both your brothers. To demonstrate," he said, "that my pursuit of you is not performed, that it costs something real." He said it with the flatness of a man stating a technical requirement. No heat, no theater. Just the fact of it, laid out like a piece of equipment to be assessed. She studied him. In the candlelight, with the hall noise around them and the 20-minute clock running, she could see the things she'd catalogued earlier in the corridor more clearly. The broken fingers healed imprecise, the sun damage around his eyes, the way he held his left shoulder fractionally higher than his right. An old injury compensated for so thoroughly it had become structural. This was a man who had been hit and gotten back up enough times that his body had rearranged itself around the process. "You're going to fight your own brothers," she said. "For me." "For the right to ask," he said. "There's a difference. You keep making that distinction, right to ask versus right to claim. Because it matters." "Does it?" she said. Not hostile, genuinely asking. Most men who go to that kind of trouble have already decided the answer. Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't fully name. It wasn't offense. It wasn't the smooth deflection of a man whose ego was being tested. It was something more interior than that, something that suggested the question had found a real edge. "I have a preference," he said. "I won't pretend otherwise, but I've watched enough men make women into the destinations of their ambitions to know that I don't want to be that. What you say at the end of this matters to me. If you say no, I will not." He paused. The pause was genuine. She could tell a genuine pause from a constructed one. "I will not spend the next 20 years of my life resenting you for it. I'll have fought for the right to ask, and you'll have the right to answer." She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the hall was beginning its pre-rite reorganization. People moving to the gallery tiers, court officials arranging the floor space, the herald conferring with the council. The central area was being cleared. Someone had brought in torch stands to augment the chandeliers. The light was going warmer and more directional, the kind of light that turned everything slightly dramatic. "You said you were in Vestmere," she said, "during the uprising." "Yes." "What did you see?" He looked at her. "You already know." "I want to hear your version." He was quiet for a beat, not because he was deciding whether to answer, because he was choosing which version was accurate. She could see the distinction in the way he held himself while he thought. "The tax collector had 4 armed men," he said. "The village had about 60 residents. He was there to collect a levy that had been doubled without notice. The village head tried to negotiate. He was 70 years old, and he'd been doing it for 40 years. Negotiating with men who had authority he didn't, and he was good at it. And it wasn't working because the collector wasn't there to negotiate. He was there to collect or to burn. She knew this part. She'd been there for this part. "You went up on the roof of the grain store," he said. "There were 4 men with you, neighbors, I think. One of them had a crossbow. You told him explicitly not to use it unless the collector's men entered a building. You used that word explicitly. I remember that. Then you climbed down and you walked across the square and you stood in front of the village head and you started talking." "It wasn't complicated," she said. "It was completely complicated," he said. "You were managing 4 men on a roof with a crossbow, 60 frightened people, 4 armed collectors, and a 70-year-old negotiator who had just run out of leverage. And you were doing all of it simultaneously while presenting a face to the collector that was calm enough to make him think backing down was his idea." "He had more to lose than we did," she said. "I told him that. Quietly, so only he heard. I told him if anything happened in that square, the report that left Vestmere would not be the report he filed. He believed you. He believed I meant it. You did mean it. Yes. Cassian looked at her with the expression she'd been trying to name since the corridor, and she got closer to the name for it now. It was the look of a man who has found something he had theoretical reasons to believe existed and had begun to doubt could actually be located. I left Vestmere 3 hours after it ended, he said. I had people ask questions, discreetly. I learned your name. I learned where you'd come from and what your situation was. He paused. I knew about Voss's promise before tonight. I wanted to know if you'd hold him to it or let it go. You were waiting to see what I'd do, she said. Yes. And if I'd let it go, if I hadn't come tonight, then I'd have found a different approach, he said. But I wouldn't have had this. He gestured minimally at the space between them, at the hall around them, at whatever this was. She thought about that, about a king with 300,000 soldiers finding a different approach, about the patience involved in 18 months of watching, about the particular quality of discipline required to hold that kind of attention over that length of time without forcing the situation. Most powerful men, she had observed this across the limited sample available to a frontier woman, but she had observed it, could not wait. Waiting felt to them like losing ground, like surrender of the initiative, like something being done to them rather than something they were doing. What Cassian had done looked from the outside like patience. What it actually was, she thought, was something closer to respect. Respect for the timeline of someone else's story. Respect for the fact that she was not a problem to be solved on his schedule. That was rarer than patience. It was rarer than almost anything. I have one question, she said. Yes. After tonight, however it ends, what do you want from me? Specifically, not philosophically, not in terms of what I'm worth or what you saw in Vestmere. What do you actually want? He didn't answer immediately. She gave him the space not to. I want you to come south, he said, not as a prize, not as a diplomatic asset. As a person I want to know better, in a place where you'd have room to figure out what that means for you. He held her gaze. I want to see what you build when you're not managing a crisis. She absorbed that. Cale said from slightly behind them, 2 minutes. The herald was ascending the platform again. The floor had been cleared. The gallery tiers were full, 500 people arranged in a horseshoe of candlelit witness, and at the base of the platform Lucien was conferring with his second, a court official, young, visibly uncertain about the night's developments. Seraphina looked at Kael. You're going first. Yes. He looked back at her with the direct, undramatic attention he'd held all evening. Don't watch if you don't want to. I'm going to watch, she said. He almost nodded. It was a very small movement. She got the sense that very small movements, for Kael, carried significant weight. She thought, these men are not what I expected. She thought, that is either the most dangerous thing about them or the most honest. She thought, I'm not sure there's a difference. The herald's voice rose above the hall. The right of sovereigns commences. By order of the Crown Council, in the matter of contested claim involving the subject Seraphina Vale of Vestmere, all parties are called to the floor. First engagement. Commander Kael Ravaryn of the Southern Empire versus Crown Heir Lucien Voss of the Auric Dominion. The floor was marble, white marble, pale gray veined with something darker, polished to the kind of finish that reflected candlelight in long, soft streaks. She had crossed it twice tonight in the ivory dress that Alar had spent 3 weeks building for a different version of this night, and now she stood at the gallery's edge and watched it become something else. Kael walked to the center with the same economical absence of performance she'd noticed in him all evening. He wasn't warming up. He wasn't adjusting or stretching or doing any of the preparatory theater that combat involved. He simply walked to where he was supposed to be and turned around and waited. And the watching of him waiting was more unsettling than anything more demonstrative would have been. He looked like a man for whom the interval before violence was simply another interval. Lucien crossed to the opposite mark. He was composed. She gave him that. He'd managed every moment of this evening with the visible competence of a man who was genuinely skilled at managing situations, and he managed this one with the same skill. Shoulders back, chin level, hand resting easy at his side above the hilt of his court sword. He had trained. She knew that. The Dominion's crown heirs were expected to. What he had not done, she understood in the moment before the herald dropped the signal cloth, was fight anyone like Kyle. It was over in 4 minutes. She had seen men fight before. In Vestmere, in the tavern, in the occasional territorial dispute that got physical on the eastern farms. She had a working understanding of what fighting looked like. What Kyle did was not quite what she had a working understanding of. He was not aggressive in the conventional sense, did not charge or press or do any of the things that less controlled fighters did when they wanted to end something quickly. He was reactive in the specific way of someone who had trained so many thousands of hours that his reactions operated at a level below thought, below intention, below anything that could be interrupted by the noise of an audience or the adrenaline of a contest. He watched Lucienne move and processed what he saw and responded with the minimal force required, which was, she was realizing, more devastating than maximum force would have been. Maximum force would have been readable, predictable, would have given Lucienne something to organize his response around. The minimal approach gave him nothing. The hall was very quiet when Lucian went down, not dramatically. There was no crash, no theatrical collapse. He went to one knee, then two, with the specific, exhausted precision of a man whose body had received enough information and decided that continuing to stand was no longer the priority. The court sword was on the floor 3 feet away. The herald was already moving. First engagement, Commander Cassian Ravaryn. The applause was uncertain, not because the outcome was disputed, but because the audience hadn't entirely decided what response was appropriate to the sight of the Dominion's crown heir on the floor of his own gala. Kyle walked back to where Cassian and Orion stood. He rolled his left shoulder once. Something had caught there, briefly, at the end, and then stopped moving and was still again. Orion said something quiet to him. Kyle said something back. She didn't catch either. Lucienne was being helped to his feet by his court official. He was not badly injured. First blood had been made, a cut along his forearm she hadn't even seen happen, and the rights conditions had been met. But he looked, she thought, like a man who had discovered something about himself that he hadn't known this morning and wasn't sure how to process. Second engagement, the herald called, Prince Auric Ravaryn of the Southern Empire versus Crown Heir Lucien Voss of the Auric Dominion. This one was different. Orion fought the way he'd spoken, with a kind of calibrated precision that read as almost conversational until you looked closely enough to see the architecture underneath it. Lucien was better in the second engagement. He'd made adjustments. He was smarter than she'd expected him to be in a purely physical contest, which she supposed made sense. He had always been good at reading situations and adapting. He landed 2 real hits. Orion let one of them connect, and she was almost certain it was deliberate. Almost certain he had made a calculation about what Lucien needed to believe was possible in order to keep his engagement real. Then he ended it, cleaner than Kyle had, faster, with the particular economy of someone who had decided the exercise was complete. Second engagement, second outcome. Lucien's court official was by him again, and Lucien was standing with the carefully maintained composure of a man absorbing something very large in a room full of people who were going to remember his face while he did it. The hall was quieter now, not the noise that wasn't silence of earlier, something more genuine. The quiet of 500 people who had arrived expecting a gala and were now watching something they didn't have a category for. Third engagement, the herald called. King Cassian Ravaryn of the Southern Empire. But it wasn't Lucien's name that followed. She heard the herald's voice shift slightly, recalibrate. She heard the council member's voice before that, urgent, the voice of someone passing a new instruction. And then the herald again, and this time the words were different. Third engagement, King Cassian Ravaryn versus Prince Auric Ravaryn. As required by the Full Right Compact, the sovereign's claim must be proven against all other claimants, including those of his own house. She looked at Cassian. He had not reacted to this, which meant he had known it was coming, had known that the right's full compact required him to fight not just for the right against Lucy's claim, but against his brother's claims as well, that the right was designed to produce not just a winner against the petitioning party, but the singular strongest claim of all present, that he had brought Kyle and Orion here tonight knowing he would have to fight them. Orion was already walking back to the center of the floor, with the specific tiredness of a man who has just finished one fight and is about to begin another, and with something else, something underneath the tiredness that looked, at the edges, like pride. Cassian shrugged out of his coat. He handed it to Kael without looking. He walked to the floor. What followed was the hardest thing she watched all evening. Not because it was vicious. It was not, or not primarily, the Ravaryn brothers knew each other too well for anything between them to be vicious. They knew the angles and the habits and the tells, and they fought with that knowledge rather than against it, which meant the engagement had a different quality than either of the previous ones. It had the quality of a conversation conducted in a language that excluded the audience. They moved around each other with the swift, intimate certainty of men who had been in close proximity for decades, who knew how the other breathed when he was tired, who had each been the first to know when the other was in trouble. Orion landed 3 hits to every 2 he received. He was faster than his older brother and he used the speed well. Cassian was not faster. What he was, she found herself understanding as she watched, was more willing. Willing to take the hit. Willing to absorb what came and stay in it and keep moving. Not because he was impervious, she could see it cost him, could see the moments where cost registered on his face, but because his calculation of acceptable loss was different from Orion's. He was willing to pay more. He had decided what this was worth, and he was paying it. When Orion finally went to one knee, it was not because he'd been worn down. It was because he'd chosen to. She understood that clearly, watching it happen. He had reached the point where he could have continued, and he had decided not to. Not from lack of ability, from a specific, deliberate choice. Brothers, she thought. The things brothers do. The herald called the engagement. Cassian was breathing with the controlled labor of a man who had spent himself considerably and was not going to let the hall see how considerably. He walked back to where Kael stood. Kael handed him the coat. Cassian held it rather than putting it back on. He looked at her across the cleared floor. Seraphina looked back. The hall was entirely still now. Not performing stillness, actually still. The way a room gets when it understands that the thing it has been watching has arrived at the moment it was building toward. Cassian walked to her. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough for low speech to carry between them and no further. He was disheveled in the way that fighting made men disheveled. Jacket off, collar loosened, a cut along his cheekbone she hadn't seen happen, and that was bleeding in the patient, unhurried way of a cut that wasn't going to stop on its own. He was breathing. She could see his chest move with it. He was, she thought, the most unguarded she had seen him all evening. She thought, this is what he looks like when the management is gone. When the evenness and the control and the steady authority are still there because they're structural, not performed, but stripped of the polish that lives on top of them. She thought, this is what he looks like in a version of honesty that costs him something. He reached into the interior pocket of the coat he was carrying. He took out a small object. She couldn't see it clearly from 3 feet. A seal, maybe, or a coin, or something that served a function she didn't have the context to identify. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her, and he went down. Not to both knees. One knee only, left knee, right foot flat on the floor, but on the marble of the Grand Meridian Hall of the Auric Dominion in front of 500 witnesses and a crown council and a herald who had gone absolutely motionless on his platform. King Cassian Ravaryn of the Southern Empire went to one knee. The sound that moved through the hall was not applause. It was not words. It was the involuntary exhalation of 500 people who had not expected to see this and didn't know what to do with having seen it. Lucian, from somewhere to her left, made a sound she couldn't translate. Cassian looked up at her. His face was level. Not beseeching, not performing the kneeling, just doing it, with the same straightforward commitment he'd applied to everything else tonight. Seraphina Vale of Vesmir, he said. His voice was quiet enough that the front rows might have caught it, and the rest of the hall had to rely on what they could read from his posture and her face. I've given this hall every demonstration available to me. I've got nothing left that's worth more than the asking. He paused. Will you come south with me? The silence held. She was aware of everything at once. The glass beads in her hem, Alara's hands at her back, the tannery smell in the rented room 2 streets over, the copper light on the river 3 years ago, the roof of the grain warehouse, the 60 people in the Vestmere Square, the 18 months between that day and this one, the weight of what the next 10 words would cost in every direction. She was aware of Adrava's voice in her memory. You retain the right to refuse the outcome. She was aware of Lucien somewhere to her left, breathing. She was aware of Cassian's face, upturned, with the blood from the cut on his cheekbone moving slow. She opened her mouth, and across the hall, from the council's elevated position, Adrava's voice cut the silence with the precision of someone who has been waiting for exactly the right moment to do something irreversible. Hold! The single word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Seraphina went still. Cassian did not move. There is a matter the council must address before any answer is given, Adrava said. Her voice was controlled in the way of someone controlling something very real. A matter that bears directly on the standing of the subject of this right. She paused. The pause was long enough to be felt in the room's collective breathing. New testimony has been submitted to the council in the last hour. Testimony relating to the bloodline of Seraphina Vale of Vestmere. The words moved through the room. Seraphina felt them move through her. Bloodline. She thought, I am a frontier woman. I am the daughter of a man who fixed roofs and a woman who died of winter fever when I was 11. I have no bloodline worth mentioning. She thought, then why is Adrava's face doing what it is doing? The council will require a recess, Adrava said. The subject of this right is requested to present herself to the council chambers. Immediately. Cassian rose from his knee. Not quickly. Deliberately. He looked at Seraphina with an expression that had, for the first time all evening, something in it that she thought might be the thing that lived on the other side of controlled certainty. Not fear, not that. More like, I did not plan for this. She looked back at him for one long second. She thought, the floor has not stopped tilting. She walked toward the council chambers, and the door behind her had not closed before she heard Lucien's voice, low, urgent, stripped of the court register he'd used all evening, saying something she couldn't make out, and Cassian's voice answering him, and then the door closed, and she was alone with whatever the council had found. The council chambers were smaller than she expected. She had imagined, in the brief transit from the hall floor to the door at the corridor's end, something proportional to the Grand Meridian, vaulted ceilings, the weight of institutional authority rendered in stone and scale. What she found was a room perhaps 30 feet across, rectangular, with a low ceiling that made the candlelight feel compressed and the walls feel closer than they were. A table. 6 chairs. A window showing nothing but the dark of the palace's interior courtyard. The 4 council members who had been on the elevated dais were here now at floor level, and at floor level they looked like what they were. 4 people in formal clothing in a small room late at night, carrying something they weren't sure how to put down. Adrava stood at the table's head. A document was open in front of her. She did not invite Seraphina to sit. How much do you know, Adrava said, about your mother's family? Seraphina looked at her. My mother died when I was 11. Her family was from the eastern provinces. I know her name and her sister's name and approximately where the land her father farmed was located. That's the entirety of it. Her name, Adrava said. Was it Vale? It was the name on her papers, Seraphina said. The name she used. Adrava looked at the document in front of her. Her name, before those papers were filed, was Mira Selvan. The room was quiet. Seraphina stood very still and let the name settle into her awareness without reacting to it, because she had grown up in a world where reacting to information before you understood it was a form of spending money you hadn't yet counted. I don't know that name, she said. No, said Adrava. You wouldn't. The Selvain line was removed from the imperial record 43 years ago. The official account described it as extinction by epidemic in the eastern provinces. That account was not accurate. The younger council member, the careful-eyed one, she still didn't have his name, said from his position at the table's right side. The Selvain dynasty ruled the eastern reach for 6 generations. The last Selvain sovereign was Queen Mira I. She was deposed in the consolidation, the political unification of the outer provinces under the Auric Dominion's direct authority. The official record states she died in the consolidation's final year. She didn't die, Seraphina said. It was not a question. She was 17, Adrava said. She was given false papers, a new name, a farm in Vestmere, and a considerable number of people with considerable motivation to ensure she never reappeared in imperial record. The arrangement was managed by the consolidation's chief architect. She paused. Grand Duke Harlan Aldrich, of the Northern Reach. The name arrived in Seraphina's chest like a slow burn. Harlan Aldrich, father of Isabeau Aldrich. Father of the woman who was, at this moment, standing in the Grand Meridian Hall wearing Lucien Voss's engagement. He knew, she said. He has always known, Adrava said. The Sylvain line didn't die in the consolidation. It survived in Vestmere, and it survived you. Seraphina was aware in the specific physiological way of a person whose body is processing something faster than their mind has caught up, of her own breathing. She could feel it in her chest, slightly shallower than normal, slightly faster. She made no effort to conceal it. She made no effort to perform composure she wasn't fully accessing right now. The Sylvain line. A deposed dynasty. A hidden heir. A farm in Vestmere with a leaking roof and a mother who died of winter fever and never once, not in 11 years, gave any indication that she had ever been anything other than a farmer's wife in a frontier province at the edge of an empire that didn't particularly notice the frontier unless it needed something from it. She thought about her mother's hands, the way they looked in winter, the way she held a book. She had held books differently from other women in Vestmere, with a particular quality of ownership, though Seraphina hadn't had the vocabulary for it at 11 years old. She thought about the one time she'd asked her mother why they didn't visit the Eastern family, and her mother had said, with a flatness that closed the question, "That part of my life is finished." She had thought it meant grief. It had meant something entirely more calculated than grief. "The testimony submitted to you tonight," Seraphina said. "Who submitted it?" Adrava and the careful-eyed man exchanged a look. "That," said Adrava, "is the part of this that requires the most careful discussion." "Tell me." "The testimony was submitted anonymously," Adrava said, "through a legal intermediary. It included documentation, genealogical records, the original consolidation papers filed by Aldrich's office, and letters. Letters written by your mother in the last 2 years of her life, addressed to a council member who was operating at that time. Those letters were sealed. They were only to be opened and submitted upon a specific condition." "What condition?" "If a member of the Sylvain bloodline entered an imperial right of sovereigns as a subject of contest," Adrava said. "Your mother designed the condition herself. Apparently she anticipated, or hoped for, a scenario in which you would need this information at a specific kind of juncture." The room moved slightly under Seraphina's feet, not physically. The marble floor was exactly where it had been. But the architecture of the last 24 years of her own life had just rearranged itself around a piece of information she hadn't known was structural, and the rearrangement had the disorienting quality of realizing that the building you've been living in was built on a different foundation than you thought. Her mother had known. Her mother had planned. Her mother had died with this inside her. This entire hidden history, this deposed dynasty, these sealed letters, and had said nothing. Had given Seraphina a leaking roof and a sister and a frontier woman's education in surviving without resources and the name of a farmer's family and nothing else. She thought, 11 years old, standing at the grave in the frozen ground outside Vestmere, thinking she understood what she'd lost. She had not understood what she'd lost. "The letters," she said. "I want to read them." "Yes," Adrava said, and her voice had something in it that hadn't been there before. Not softness. Adrava was not a soft woman, but something adjacent, the kind of careful handling that people applied to things they recognized as genuinely fragile. "They're being copied. You'll have them before morning." Seraphina pressed the heel of her hand flat against her sternum for 1 second. Not a gesture she planned. Her body made it on its own, pressing against the specific pressure that lived there now, the weight of a history she'd inherited without knowing she was carrying it. Then she took her hand away. "What does this mean?" she said. "For the right." Adrava looked at her steadily. "It changes your standing significantly. You are no longer a frontier woman without political standing. You are the surviving heir of a deposed but legally unextinguished dynasty. The Sylvain line was never formally dissolved by the council. It was simply removed from the record. The removal was, under the original compact, procedurally irregular." "Aldrich's office removed it," Seraphina said. "Yes, and Aldrich's daughter is currently engaged to the Dominion's crown heir." "Yes," the careful-eyed man said carefully, The implications of the bloodline documentation for the Auric family's political position are significant. If the Sylvain removal is ruled irregular, the consolidation agreement that gave the Auric family their current territorial authority becomes contestable, which means, Seraphina said, that the man who buried my mother's identity built his family's power on the foundation of that burial. And if the foundation is pulled, the structure above it becomes uncertain, Adrava finished. The silence in the chamber had a different quality from the hall's silence. It was tighter, more concentrated. The silence of people in a small room who are in the presence of something that has real consequences and are being careful about how they breathe around it. Seraphina thought about Lucien. She thought about the announcement from the platform, the gold coat, the way his eyes had found her across the crowd and then moved on. She thought about 3 years of a promise made at a copper river and maintained through distance and hope, and the specific discipline of a woman who had learned not to need more than she was given. She thought about Lucien's father's relationship with Grand Duke Auric, which was old and deep and the source of significant political architecture. She thought about what it meant that Lucien's engagement to Isabeau Auric had been announced on the same night that this documentation had been submitted to the council. When was the testimony submitted? She said. Exactly. Adrava paused for a moment too long. Before the gala began, the careful-eyed man said. It arrived at the council chambers at 4 this afternoon. Seraphina absorbed this. Before the gala, before the announcement, before Lucien walked out in gold and named Isabeau Auric as his future queen. Before the rite, before any of it. Someone had known she was coming tonight and had submitted this documentation before the evening began. The anonymous intermediary, she said. Is there anything about them in the submission? Only a seal, Adrava said. She slid a piece of paper across the table, a wax impression, copied onto vellum. A small design. Not the Dominion's crest. Not anything she recognized from the Ravaryn house markings she'd catalogued from Cassian's coat. Something older. A design with the quality of something that predated the current imperial architecture. She studied it. I don't recognize this, she said. We didn't expect you would, Adrava said. It's a very old seal. It belongs to a network that hasn't been formally active for decades. We have theories about its current membership, but nothing provable. Seraphina looked up from the paper. Someone engineered tonight. Adrava held her gaze without flinching. It appears that way. That someone wanted me in this rite, wanted the bloodline revealed at this specific moment, wanted the Auric connection made visible while the Auric family is in the process of cementing their alliance with the Dominion. She paused. Someone wanted all of this to happen in front of 500 witnesses. The timing, the careful-eyed man said, with the precision of a man who chose his words with respect for their consequences, is not accidental. She stood in the council chamber of the Auric Dominion, and she felt something happen inside her that was not quite anger and was not quite grief, and was not quite the particular cold clarity that came after both of those things had burned through. It was all three of those things simultaneously, occupying different rooms in the same building, and the building was her chest. And the question was what to do with a structure that was suddenly housing things it hadn't been designed to contain. This was what betrayal actually felt like, she understood. Not the sharp immediate version, not Lucien on the platform, which had been devastating but clean, which had been a thing she could identify and name and carry out of the building. This was the longer kind, the kind that went back further than tonight, the kind where you realized that the architecture of your entire life, the leaking roof, the frontier distance, the absence of history, the 11-year-old girl at the frozen grave, had been constructed by someone else's decision, and you had been living inside their construction without knowing it was constructed. Her mother had known. Her mother had planned. Her mother had built her, without her knowledge or consent, into a woman capable of surviving tonight. Had given her exactly the tools required, the frontier hardness, the careful reading of rooms, the ability to stand still under attention without giving the attention what it wanted. Had given her all of it and had given her none of the context. She thought, I don't know if that was love or strategy. She thought, I don't know if there's a difference. I need to go back to the hall, she said. The council's recess. How long does the rite allow for recess? She said. The careful-eyed man consulted something. 1 hour from invocation of the recess. 40 minutes remaining. Then I have 40 minutes, she said, and I need 30 of them in the hall. Adrava looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman recalibrating her assessment. It was not a small recalibration. You'll have them, she said. Seraphina walked out of the chamber. The corridor was not empty. She had expected Cassian. She realized when she saw him, been expecting him since the chamber door closed behind her, had known with the certainty of someone who has been paying attention all evening that he would be here, that he would not wait in the hall, that whatever patience he demonstrated over 18 months of watching had its limits, and those limits were roughly the length of time she'd been alone with 4 council members and a document about her bloodline. He was standing at the corridor's far end, near the window, with his coat on again, and the cut on his cheekbone, doing what it had been doing, bleeding slowly, with the patient persistence of something that would not be ignored indefinitely. Orion was not with him. Kyle was not with him. He had come alone. She walked toward him. He read her face. She could see him doing it, the same careful assessment he'd been running all evening. And something in his expression shifted with the adjustment of a man absorbing information he hadn't possessed before. How bad? He said. Define bad, she said. For you. She stopped in front of him, close enough that she didn't have to modulate her voice for the corridor. My mother was Mira Selvane, the last queen of the Eastern Reach. She was hidden in Vestmere 40 years ago by a man named Harlan Aldrich after he deposed her dynasty in the Consolidation. I am her surviving heir. The documentation establishing this was submitted to the council this afternoon before the gala began by someone using a seal neither I nor Adrava recognizes. She watched him take this in. He did not react with surprise in the conventional sense. What moved across his face was something more specific. The look of a man who is receiving information that intersects with existing information he possesses, and who is making very rapid calculations about what the intersection means. You knew something, she said. It was not quite an accusation. It was the tightly contained beginning of one. I knew there were questions about your background that I hadn't been able to fully answer, he said. I knew that the reports from Vestmere didn't entirely account for how you moved in that square, the way you handled authority, the way you understood institutional power without having been trained in it. I noted it. I didn't know what to make of it. Did you submit that testimony? The question landed in the corridor and lay there. He held her gaze. No. She studied his face. She had been studying faces in difficult rooms for long enough to have developed some competence at it, and what she saw in his face was the specific quality of a man telling the truth about a question whose answer was not entirely simple. But you know who did, she said. The pause was slight, genuine, not manufactured. I have a strong suspicion, he said. Tell me. Not yet, he said. The temperature in the corridor changed, not physically, in the quality of the air between them. Not yet, she repeated. Because if I tell you now, he said, it will change the decisions you make in the next 40 minutes in ways I can't predict. And the decisions you make in the next 40 minutes have consequences I'm not willing to risk on incomplete information. She looked at him. You're withholding information from me, about my own history, about who engineered tonight, because you've decided that managing the timing of what I know serves some larger purpose. Yes, he said. No softening, no deflection, just the flat acknowledgement of a man who has made a calculation and is willing to own it. This, she thought, was what power actually looked like from the inside, not the kneeling on the marble floor, not the fight against his brothers or the blood or the public demonstration. This, the moment where the person with more information decided what the person with less information got to know and when. This was the mechanism, the gears behind the face that knelt. She felt something shift in her chest that was not anger. Anger was too simple, too immediate, too much a product of this specific moment. What she felt was the recognition of a pattern, the recognition that she had spent 24 years being managed by the information that other people decided she should have. Her mother, the frontier institutions, Lucien, and now standing in a palace corridor with a king's blood on his cheekbone and his coat back on, Cassian Ravaryn. You should know, she said very quietly, that I have spent my entire life being given exactly the information that people with more power than me decided I could handle. My mother did it. The Dominion does it. and you're doing it right now, in a corridor, after kneeling on the floor of a hall and asking me if I'd choose you." He was quiet. "I'm not asking you to undo it," she said. "I'm telling you I've noticed it, and I need you to understand the difference between those two things." "I understand the difference," he said. "Do you?" "Yes," he said. And then, after a pause, "Sorry." She hadn't expected that. Not the word itself. She'd heard apologies from powerful men twice tonight already. But the quality of it. The absence of follow-up justification. The way he said it like it was a complete sentence rather than the opening of a larger argument about why he'd been right. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the Vestmere Square, the 60 people, the collector with his 4 armed men. She had managed that situation by understanding very quickly what each person in it needed to believe was true. The collector needed to believe that backing down was his idea. The men on the roof needed to believe the crossbow was still an option. The village head needed to believe she had a plan. She had managed it by controlling information. She was standing in a corridor being managed the same way by a man she had spent one evening deciding she might trust, and she was angry about it, and the anger was right and appropriate, and the anger also coexisted, uncomfortably, with the understanding that she had done the same thing, with the same calculation, for the same reason. Because the information available in a crisis is always incomplete, and the person who decides what others know holds the initiative. The question was not whether Cassian had managed her. He had. The question was what he was managing toward. "Tell me this much," she said. "The person who submitted that testimony, are they working against me?" He considered the question with the specific care of a man choosing between precision and simplicity. "Not against you," he said, "but not purely for you either. They have their own agenda. Tonight advances it. And their agenda and mine, are they compatible?" "For now," he said. "Possibly. I don't know how long." She absorbed this. It was not reassuring. It was the kind of answer that only honest people gave, because dishonest people would have made it sound better. "All right," she said. She walked past him toward the hall. "Seraphina." She stopped. Did not turn. "Whatever you're about to do in there," he said, "you should know that the right is still active. The council's recess doesn't suspend the outcome. When the recess ends, you still have a right to answer." "I know," she said. "Whatever the bloodline documentation means for your political standing, it doesn't change what I asked you." She stood in the corridor for a moment with her back to him and the hall noise ahead of her and the council chambers behind, and the feeling of the glass beads in her hem, still there. Still Ilara's hands, still the tannery room 2 streets over where a sister was waiting who didn't know any of this yet. "I know that too," she said. She pushed through the door to the hall. She found Lucien in approximately 20 seconds because Lucien was not difficult to find in a room when he wanted to be visible. And right now he wanted to be visible in the specific way of a man who has been beaten on the floor of a right and is in the process of recovering his authority through sheer force of presence. He was at the hall's north end, in conversation with 3 men she recognized as senior Dominion officials. And the conversation looked serious in the way that conversations between powerful men always looked serious when the environment around them had just destabilized. She walked toward him. He saw her coming. The officials saw her coming. The officials made the small adjustments of men who understood that they were about to be not needed here and began their withdrawal with the smooth expertise of professional bystanders. Lucien looked at her face, and something in his composure flickered. "What did they tell you?" he said. "You know what they told me," she said. "I don't—" "Lucien." She said his name with the flatness of a woman who has run out of patience for indirection at 11 p.m. on the worst night of her recent life. "Your fiancé's father buried my mother's identity 40 years ago. You have been in conversation with Harlan Aldrich for the better part of your political career. You announced your engagement to his daughter on the night that documentation about my bloodline was submitted to the council." She paused 1 beat. "Tell me what you know." He was quiet for a moment. The composure held. She had to give him that. The composure was genuinely structural rather than performed. It was one of the things she'd respected about him. But underneath it, something was moving. "I knew there were questions about your background," he said. The words were so close to what Cassian had said that for a moment she felt the ground tilt again. "How long?" she said. 2 2 years, he said. I received information 2 years ago suggesting your mother's papers might not be original. 2 years. While she was waiting in Vestmere for a vow made at a river, while she was managing crops and neighbors and the ordinary surviving of a frontier winter, while she was writing letters that took 3 weeks to receive an answer to, if they received one at all. He had known for 2 years. You let me wait, she said. I was trying to... It was a complicated situation. The implications for the Aldrich alliance were... You let me wait, she said again. Not louder, but differently weighted. He stopped. She looked at him with the specific attention she'd been using all evening. The reading of faces, the cataloging of what was real beneath what was managed. And she saw something she hadn't seen from him before. Something that had been there, maybe, for a long time. Underneath all the calculation and the court composure and the skill with which he handled rooms and people and political situations. Fear, not of her specifically, of what she represented now. Of a woman standing in the hall of the empire with a deposed dynasty's blood in her veins and 40 minutes left in a rite that had already put the most powerful king in the southern hemisphere on one knee, asking her a question. You filed that petition tonight, she said, to protect yourself, not me. If I walk out of this rite as a Ravaryn consort with a Selvan bloodline, the questions it raises about the Aldrich consolidation put your entire political foundation at risk. The alliance you just announced your engagement to cement becomes a liability rather than an asset. He didn't deny it. The not denying was, in some ways, the most honest thing he'd done all evening. You were trying to control the damage, she said, before I understood there was damage to control. There are considerations, he said, that go beyond what any one person... I know, she said. I understand institutional considerations. I've understood them my whole life. I just didn't understand until tonight that one of the considerations was me. She looked at him for one more moment. She was aware of the clock. 30 minutes she'd given herself, and she'd used most of it in the corridor and the chamber. The hall was watching, had been watching since she came back through the doors, was doing the thing it did. The slow, collective recalibration of 500 people trying to update the story they were in. I'm going to give you something, she said. Not because you deserve it, because it's accurate, and I prefer accuracy to other options. He waited. What you did tonight, the announcement, the petition, the management, was not purely cynical. I know that. You were trying to hold together an alliance that your Dominion needs and do it in a way that didn't require you to explain things you weren't ready to explain. I understand that logic. She paused. I don't forgive it, but I understand it, and I think you should know that I understand it because it means I'm not standing here purely on hurt. I'm standing here on information, and that's a different kind of standing. He looked at her. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her by the river once, 3 years ago. Not the calculated look, not the crown heir look, but whatever lived underneath those things. The version of Lucien Voss that had ridden into Vestmere on a pale horse and looked up at a woman on a roof and thought, that. Seraphina, he said, I made a mistake. Yes, she said, a large one, across a long period of time. I know. I believe you, she said. It doesn't change tonight. She turned and walked back toward the center of the hall. Behind her, she heard him say something, low, not directed at her, directed at one of the returning officials. And she heard the word Aldrich and the word contingency, and she filed both away with the mechanical efficiency of a woman who had just learned that her life had been other people's contingency for considerably longer than tonight. Orion materialized beside her with the specific unobtrusiveness of a man who had been watching where she would need to be met. 2 minutes to end of recess, he said. I know. Cassian. I spoke to him, she said. Orion was quiet for a beat. He told you he suspects who submitted the testimony. He told me he wasn't going to tell me yet. Ah, said Orion. The single syllable carried more freight than most people's paragraphs. He'll have had a reason. He had a reason, she said. I told him what I thought of it. And he apologized, she said, without qualification. Orion absorbed this. He doesn't do that often. I know, she said. That's why I noticed it. The herald was ascending the platform again. A drava was emerging from the corridor that led to the council chambers. The hall was reassembling itself around the coming conclusion of the rite. Bodies repositioning, attention refocusing, the particular rustle of an audience that has been waiting and senses the waiting is nearly over. Cassian was standing where she'd left him. He had not moved to the center. He was waiting for her, she understood. Not waiting in the sense of expecting her to come to him, but waiting in the sense of leaving the motion her choice. She looked across the floor at him. She thought, 18 months. Vestmere, a king who traveled without announcement to see what people were when they thought no one important was watching. She thought, a man who just withheld information from me and apologized for it without immediately explaining why he was right to do it. She thought, a woman who is the heir of a deposed dynasty standing in the hall of the empire that deposed it, in a dress her sister made for a different night, about to answer a question that will determine the next chapter of a story she didn't know she was in. She thought, the floor has been tilting all evening. She thought, I have been standing on tilting floors my entire life. The herald's voice rose. The council's recess has concluded. All parties are called to the floor for the final determination of the right of sovereigns. She walked to the center. Cassian walked to meet her. They stopped with 3 feet of marble between them and 500 witnesses around them, and the weight of whatever the next 60 seconds would build, pressing down on the room from every direction. He looked at her face and she saw him read it, the whole of it, the council chamber and the corridor and Lucien and the letters her mother had written and sealed and the 40-year-old hidden grave of an entire dynasty. And he read it with the same accuracy he'd applied all evening, and his expression did not ask her to resolve any of it for his comfort. He simply stood there, with the cut on his cheekbone still bleeding its patient, slow bleed, and he waited. The herald said, the subject of contest is called to give her answer. She looked at Cassian. She opened her mouth. From the gallery above the hall's west entrance, from a position that no one should have occupied during the rite, that should have been cleared and empty, a single piece of paper fell. It fluttered down from the gallery's edge with the unhurried motion of something released deliberately, and it landed on the marble floor 3 feet from where she stood, and in the absolute silence of a hall that had gone entirely still at the sight of it, she bent and picked it up. She read it. She read it again. She looked up at the gallery. Empty. Whoever had been there was gone. She looked at the paper in her hand. It was not long. 8 lines. In a handwriting she had never seen before, but that she recognized with the bone-deep certainty of someone seeing their own features in a stranger's face. The handwriting of a woman who had been educated well and had spent 40 years making herself smaller than her education. The last 2 lines read, "They will come for the documentation before morning. Aldrich's people are already in the palace. The council chambers will not hold." And below that, in a different hand, more recent ink, different pressure. "Run. Take the Ravaryn offer. It's the only door still open. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner. I'm sorry about all of it." No signature. She didn't need one. She looked at Cassian. He was watching her face. He could not read the paper from where he stood. He was reading her instead. "We need to leave," she said. "Right now. Tonight." He held her gaze for 1 second. Just one. Then he turned and looked at Kael. Kael was already moving. Kael moved the way water moves when there is no longer a container, fast, without announcement, filling every available space between the hall's edge and the corridor doors before anyone in the room had fully registered that something had changed. Seraphina watched him go and tucked the paper into the bodice of her dress, the only pocket available to her. Alara had not sewn pockets into the ivory gown because pockets were not part of the original version of this night. And she looked at Cassian and said, quietly and with the specific economy of someone who has already decided, "How many men do you have in this building?" 12 in the palace, he said. 40 in the city. Armed? The 12 are armed. The 40 are accessible. How long to reach the city contingent? 20 minutes if we move now. 30 if we wait. She looked at the gallery where the paper had come from. Still empty. Whoever had been there had known exactly how long they had before the recess ended. Had timed the drop for the moment of maximum attention, when everyone in the hall was focused on the floor, on her, on the conclusion of the rite. The calculation was precise in the way that only long familiarity with a location produced. Someone who knew the palace. Someone who had been here before, many times, with enough access to position themselves in a cleared gallery during a formal imperial proceeding. She filed that away. The council chambers, she said. If Aldrich's people are already in the palace. The documentation, Cassian said. Adrava said they were copying it. If they're interrupted before the copies are complete, he was already turning. Orion. Orion had been 3 feet away for the entire conversation, which was, she was learning, Orion's preferred operating distance. Close enough to act on any development, far enough to avoid the appearance of crowding it. He moved into the conversation with the smooth integration of a man who had already been tracking it. Council chambers, Cassian said. The documentation. I heard, Orion said. He looked at Seraphina. Is there anything in those letters that doesn't exist in another form? Anything that's only in those documents? She thought about what Adrava had described. Genealogical records, consolidation papers, her mother's letters. The letters, she said. My mother's letters. If there are other copies, I don't know where they are. Orion's jaw moved once. Then we need the letters before anything else. He went. Not running, that would have communicated urgency to every watching set of eyes in the hall, but at the particular pace of a man moving through a room with clear intention, which read as authoritative rather than alarmed, which cleared people from his path more efficiently than running would have. The herald on the platform had gone uncertain. The formal proceedings were supposed to have continued. The answer was supposed to have been given. The rite was supposed to have concluded. And instead, the subjects of the rite were having a quiet conversation at the floor's center, while 2 of the Ravaryn brothers had effectively disappeared from the room. The herald looked at Adrava. Adrava looked at the floor with the expression of a woman rapidly recalculating. We should move, Cassian said. Not out of the hall. That's what they'd expect. They'll have exits covered. They, she said. Aldrich's people. Aldrich's people, he confirmed. 12 men, minimum. Probably more. If this was planned with the documentation submission as the trigger, they've had since this afternoon to position. She thought about the building around her. She had arrived tonight with no map of it beyond the entrance, the hall, and the corridor she'd been walked down toward the council chambers. She had the women in rooms they weren't invited to skill of cataloging exits, which had given her the 2 visible archways and the door to the council corridor. She had no idea what lay beyond any of them in structural terms. You've been in this building before, she said. 3 times, he said. The last time was 4 years ago. Does it have an East servant's access? He looked at her with a slight shift of attention, the look of a man who has just received information about someone that updates his existing model. Yes, through the kitchens. All formal imperial buildings do, she said. Vesmir's district hall had the same architecture. The servant's access is never covered because covering it requires knowing that the person you're managing knows it exists. You know it exists, he said. Now we both do, she said. Where are your 12 men? 4 at the palace's main entrance, 4 at the east gate, 4 in the staff quarters on the building's 2nd level. The 2nd level 4, she said. Can you reach them without going through the main corridor? The servants stare, he said. Yes. Then that's where we go, she said. Not out, up. We get your men and we get to the council chambers before Orion does, and we make sure those letters leave this building. He held her gaze for a moment. She was aware that they were standing in the center of a hall with 500 witnesses and a stalled rite and a herald who was starting to look genuinely alarmed, and that their conversation was being watched without being heard, and that what people were watching, a king and a frontier woman at the hall's center in quiet, rapid, practical discussion, was generating a new page of the story the room was writing. She was also aware that she had stopped somewhere in the last 3 minutes, waiting for him to lead. He noticed that too. She could see him notice it. Right side of the hall, he said. Behind the 3rd pillar from the north, there's a door that looks like paneling. Servants' access to the kitchen level. From there, the stair to the 2nd level is 40 feet east. She turned and walked for the 3rd pillar. He kept pace beside her. Behind them, the herald made a sound. The trained projection of a man whose entire professional identity was wrapped up in formal proceedings that were currently not being observed. And Adrava's voice cut across it, low and sharp, and whatever she said to him made him stop. Good, Seraphina thought. Adrava was doing the math. Adrava was, she suspected, a woman who had spent 20 years watching imperial proceedings and had developed a very precise sense of when a proceeding had been overtaken by something more urgent than itself. The paneled door was exactly where Cassian said it would be. It looked, from the hall side, like 3 feet of decorative wall. From the interior side, she could see the hinges and the simple iron latch and the smell of kitchen, fat and wood smoke, and the particular heavy warmth of a room where things had been cooking for hours. She went through first. The kitchen was massive and, at this hour of the gala, operating at full production. Dozens of staff moving between preparation surfaces and hearths with the orchestrated chaos of a system that knew its own logic even when it looked from the outside like disorder. Several of them looked up when the door opened. None of them said anything. She filed that away too. Palace kitchen staff were trained to not react to things coming through service doors. It was part of the job. Cassian was 2 steps behind her. He moved through the kitchen with the absence of self-consciousness that distinguished people who had been in working environments from people who had only been in rooms designed to receive them. He was not performing comfort. He simply did not hesitate. The stair was where he'd said. Narrow, stone, with a rope handrail worn smooth by decades of hands. She went up it fast, holding her hem with one hand to keep the glass beads from the stone, and she was aware of her own breathing, harder than she'd have liked, the corset doing what corsets did to the lungs during physical exertion, which was the specific unhelpfulness of a garment designed for a different kind of evening. Second level. A corridor that was narrower than the formal hallways below, less decorated, with the functional plainness of spaces intended for people whose job was maintaining the spaces other people occupied. Cassian moved past her and knocked twice on the 4th door on the right. The door opened in approximately 3 seconds, which told her everything she needed to know about the quality of the men he traveled with. They didn't need to think about whether to open it. They opened it because their king knocked, and they were already dressed and positioned because they had been dressed and positioned since they arrived, because they were the kind of men who didn't take coats off in uncertain environments. There were 4 of them. She looked at them quickly, not the social assessment she'd been doing all evening, but the faster, more physical read of someone who needed to know in 10 seconds whether these men were capable of what was about to be asked of them. They were. "Council chambers," Cassian said. "My brother is there or on his way. There may be armed opposition. We move now." No questions. They moved. This was the thing about trained men, and she had encountered versions of them in Vesmir, when the border disputes got serious enough that the Dominion sent soldiers rather than collectors. This was the thing that people who hadn't been around them often misunderstood. It wasn't that they were incapable of questions. It was that they had developed the judgment to know which situations had room for questions and which ones didn't, and they applied that judgment correctly, which was actually harder than it sounded. The 6 of them moved down the corridor in the specific compression of people who have silently agreed on a pace and direction, and she was in the middle of it, and the glass beads in her hem were making a sound against the stone floor that was too small to matter, and that she noticed anyway, the way you notice small, consistent things in moments of very large inconsistency. The council chambers corridor intersected the servant passage through a door at its north end. She heard the voices before they reached it. Low, multiple. The particular vocal quality of men who were trying not to be loud and were not fully succeeding. Cassian put his hand up. Everyone stopped. She counted. 4 voices. Possibly 5. The sound of something heavy being shifted. She looked at Cassian. He looked at the door. He looked at his 4 men. A series of very small signals passed between them. Glances, chin movements, the slight repositioning of hands, that she couldn't entirely parse, but that clearly constituted a plan, because afterward the 4 men arranged themselves around the door with the wordless coordination of people who had done this before. She put her hand on Cassian's arm. He looked at her. She said at a volume that barely displaced air, "The letters," before anything else. He nodded. He went through the door. What followed occupied approximately 90 seconds of clock time and contained enough information that her mind filed it in a different format. Not sequential, not narrative, but overlapping, the way genuinely fast events lived in memory afterward as layers rather than scenes. 5 men in the council corridor. Not in livery, in plain clothes, which was smarter. which meant someone had thought about this carefully enough to know that Imperial Palace livery would create questions that plainclothes wouldn't. Two of them had gotten to the council chamber door. The door was not yet open. Adrava's chambers were solidly built, old stone, good locks. But they had tools, and they were working on it with the focused efficiency of men who knew they had a limited time window. Cassian's 4 men were very good at their jobs. She did not watch the details of the 90 seconds because there were more useful things to do with 90 seconds than watch them. She went to the council chamber door, and she knocked in the specific pattern that Adrava had used from the inside. 3, then 2, and she said, at a volume calculated to carry through old stone without carrying further, Adrava, it's Seraphina Vale. I need you to open this door. Silence from inside. Then Adrava's voice, cautious and close to the door. How many with you? 1. The king. A pause. The sound of a bolt. The door opened 4 inches, held by a chain, and Adrava's eye appeared in the gap with the focused assessment of a woman who was running her own risk calculations. She must have reached an acceptable result because the chain came off and the door opened. The chamber inside was in the middle of controlled disorder. The council's documents moved from the table to what appeared to be a lockbox, Adrava's hand steady with the practiced speed of someone who had run this kind of contingency before. The careful-eyed council member was on the other side of the room, holding a leather portfolio, with the expression of a man who is maintaining composure through the specific discipline of having decided that panic was not a useful resource. The letters, Seraphina said. Adrava looked at her. They haven't been fully copied. How much is copied? 6 of the 9. Give me the originals. If the originals leave this chamber, if the originals stay in this chamber, Aldrich's men will have them inside the hour, she said. The copies stay here. The council has them as a record. The originals come with me. It was, she understood, the kind of decision that had consequences she couldn't fully map from inside this specific room on this specific night. It was the kind of decision that institutional people whose identity was built around the management of documents and records and the preservation of official process, found genuinely difficult because their training was for the document to be the thing that mattered and the person who held the document to be its custodian, not its owner. Adrava was not, she thought, primarily an institutional person. She was a person who had been working in an institution long enough to know the difference between what the institution was built to protect and what it had become. She handed Seraphina the letters. 9 folded pieces of paper, worn at the creases in the way of things that had been folded and unfolded many times before being sealed for the last time. She could see her mother's handwriting on the outer fold of the top one, and looking at it produced a physical sensation in her chest that she did not have time to sit with. She put them inside the bodice of the dress, against the note from the gallery, against her sternum, against her heart. She looked at Adrava. The copies need to be somewhere the Aldrich network can't access. I know several places, Adrava said. Good. Cassian appeared in the doorway. His coat had a new problem, a tear along the left shoulder that hadn't been there before. He looked at Seraphina and then at her hand pressed flat against her chest and understood. We have a window, he said. 20 minutes, maybe less. The men in the corridor weren't the whole contingent. You know that? One of them told us, he said. The flatness with which he said it told her everything she needed to know about how one of them had come to be in a telling mood. How many more? He didn't know the full number. He knew there was a secondary team at the East Gate, she thought. The East Gate was where 4 of his men were stationed. Secondary team at the East Gate meant Aldrich's contingency had covered the most logical exit from the palace and positioned against the Ravaryn presence there simultaneously. They're not trying to stop us from leaving, she said. They're trying to separate us from your men. He held her gaze. She could see the calculation running behind his eyes. Fast, layered, the kind of strategic reading that took years of actual warfare to develop, rather than simulated versions of it. If we split, he said slowly, they can manage each piece separately. Yes, so we don't split. The East Gate is covered. The main entrance is probably covered, she said. Yes. The servant's exit from the kitchen runs to the stable yard, he said. It's a working entrance. Deliveries, staff departure, waste removal. He paused. and she recognized the pause of a man who was revising his own assumption mid-sentence. It's probably not covered, because covering it requires knowing we know it exists. And we've established that they haven't planned for that, she said. Something moved in his expression that she thought, in a different context, she might have called a smile. It was very brief. Yes, she looked at Adrava. Is there anything else in this chamber that should not be here when they arrive? Adrava was already moving. Go, she said. I've been in difficult rooms before. Seraphina believed her. They went back through the servant passage, back through the kitchen. Less surprised staff this time. The kitchen had absorbed the first transit and filed it under unusual but not their business. And out through a heavy wooden door in the kitchen's far wall into the cold of the stable yard. The night air hit her like a hand. She hadn't been outside since she'd arrived at the Meridian hours ago, and the contrast between the candle-heated interior and the open air of a spring night in the capital was physical enough to make her catch a breath. She could smell horses and straw and the particular mineral smell of cold stone that had been rained on recently. The stable yard was lit by 2 torches mounted at the yard's corners and the diffuse glow from the palace's upper windows. It was not empty. Stable workers moved at the far end, managing horses that had been brought in for the gala's guests. But it was not watched, not in the organized way of men with a plan. Not yet. Orion was there. He was standing at the yard's center with the leather portfolio she'd seen the careful-eyed council member holding, and beside him was a young man in stable clothes who was either a real stable worker or very committed to the appearance of one, and 4 horses were saddled and waiting with the specific patience of horses that had been waiting for a while. "Letters?" Orion said. "Here," she said, touching her chest. He looked at his brother. "We've got one problem." "Tell me," Cassian said. "Kale's not back," Orion said. "I haven't been able to reach him since the hall." The stable yard absorbed this. She had been tracking Kael's absence without fully naming it to herself. He had gone ahead from the hall into the palace, and she had not seen him since. And she had been moving through the last 30 minutes on the assumption that he was somewhere she couldn't see, doing something that required him to be somewhere she couldn't see, which was consistent with everything she'd observed about how Kael Ravaryn operated. But Orion was Kael's brother, and Orion was standing in the stable yard with 4 horses and an expression that was controlled in the specific way of someone controlling something urgent. "He can handle himself," Cassian said. "He can handle himself," Orion agreed. "The question is whether 12 armed men decided to use him as the secondary problem. The secondary problem. Not the primary target. Not her. Not the documents. Not the Ravaryn contingent's exit from the palace. The secondary problem? The obstacle to be managed while the primary operation proceeded. Remove Kael, separate the Ravaryn force, and the corridor work became manageable. She thought, if they've taken Kael, they've had him for 20 minutes. She thought, 20 minutes with a man like Kael is either nothing or everything, depending on the numbers. "We go back in," she said. Both brothers looked at her. "We are not leaving this building without him," she said. "I won't." She stopped, because the word won't was not quite right, was too small for what she meant. "I'm not walking out of this building because it became convenient to do so, leaving behind a man who is here because of me." Cassian looked at her for one long second. She looked back. There are moments in crisis. She had learned this in Vestmere, in smaller crises than this, in the grain store square and the winter before that and the winter before that, where the decision made is not the one with the most tactical logic, but the one that establishes something about what kind of person you are willing to be under pressure. Most of the time, tactics and character pointed the same direction. Sometimes they didn't. This was a sometimes. "Orion," Cassian said. He did not look away from her. "Take the horses to the south wall. Wait 15 minutes. And if you're not there in 15, then use your judgment," Cassian said. "You always do." Orion looked at his brother. He looked at Seraphina. He said nothing. He took the horses. She and Cassian went back through the kitchen door. The kitchen had changed in texture since the last transit. Something had reached the staff, some communication. The way staff communication always moved in large buildings faster than formal information, running through the back corridors and the shared spaces where people actually spent their time. The faces that looked up were more alert, more careful, One of the kitchen workers, older, with the face of someone who had spent 4 decades in this building's employ, caught her eye as she passed and held it for exactly 1 second and then moved his gaze toward the ceiling. Up, she registered this. She caught Cassian's arm. He stopped. She tilted her head slightly upward, the same gesture the worker had made. Cassian looked at the ceiling, looked at the worker. The worker had already returned to his work with the completeness of a man who had communicated everything he intended to communicate. Cassian changed direction. Not the servant stare they'd used before. A different one, further back, narrower, the kind of stare that existed in buildings because buildings needed more infrastructure than their formal design acknowledged. 3rd level. The air up here was different, colder, less circulated. The smell of dust and stone and the close quality of spaces that didn't see much use. Storerooms, unused chambers, the accumulated physical residue of a building old enough to have outlived several versions of its own purpose. They moved quietly. She had taken her shoes off somewhere on the stair. The glass beads in her hem were manageable, but the heels on the shoes were not, were making a sound against the stone that she was not willing to make. And the marble was cold under her feet, and she held the shoes in one hand and moved in the specific contained silence of a woman who had learned how to be quiet in occupied buildings long before tonight. The sound came from the east end of the 3rd level corridor. Not loud, intermittent. The sound of something methodical being done to something that was resisting. They reached the doorway. The room beyond was a storeroom set, crates, rolled tapestries, the dust-covered furniture of a palace's overflow. There was one torch, mounted on the wall, and in its light Kael was visible, seated on the floor with his back against a crate and his hand secured behind him with what looked like 2 belts knotted together, which told her immediately that whoever had taken him had not planned for this contingency and had improvised with available materials. 2 men stood over him. A 3rd was near the door. She nearly walked into him, caught herself in the last step, pressed flat against the corridor wall. Cassian registered her stop and stopped also. She held up 3 fingers. He nodded. She looked at Kael. His face was directed at the 2 men standing over him, and he was speaking to them in a low, even voice that she couldn't make out from here, which meant he'd been speaking to them, keeping them occupied, keeping their attention on him, with the controlled patience of a man who understood that the best thing he could do while restrained was to keep the restrainers looking at him and not at the door. He saw her. She saw him see her. Nothing in his face changed. Nothing in his body changed. He continued talking to the 2 men with the same low, even, conversational quality he'd been using before. He did not look at her again. She looked at Cassian. She held up 1 finger, the man at the door. She pointed at herself. She pointed at the door. He looked at her with the expression of a man who was about to say something and was deciding against it. Good, she thought. She went for the man at the door from his blind side, which was the left, which she'd identified from his posture as the side he didn't favor. She did not hit him. She pressed the heel of her shoe, which was in her hand, which had a solid wooden heel designed for a different evening but functional for this one, against the side of his neck with the specific precision of a woman who had learned from the men who managed the Vestmere disputes, exactly where that particular pressure produced the fastest results. He went down. The 2 men near Kael turned. Cassian was already through the door. What followed was brief and sufficient. Cassian fought with the same quality she'd watched in the hall. Not the controlled demonstration of the right, but something rawer, more economic, the fighting of a man who is not performing anything for any audience. He took 1 hit to the ribs that made his breath catch audibly. He did not stop moving. When it was over, he crossed to Kael and worked at the belt knots with hands that were not quite steady. The rib hit, she thought, had been harder than the audible catch suggested. And Kael said, while this was happening, 4 minutes. We know, Cassian said. There's a man on the 2nd level who went to report. He left 6 minutes ago. We need to move, she said. Kael stood. He assessed himself in the specific full-body inventory of a man who has been recently restrained and is determining what still works and what needs to be compensated for. Then he looked at her, at the shoes in her hand, at her bare feet on the cold stone, at the dress with the glass beads, at the letters she had pressed against her chest. You came back, he said. It was not a question. It was not surprised. It had the quality of an observation being filed in a place where it would be kept. "Yes," she said. He nodded. The very small movement, the significant weight. They went for the stair. The building around them was changing. She could feel it, the way a building changes when something organized is moving through it. The particular quality of coordinated human movement that registered as a change in air pressure, in sound frequency, in the small tremors of floor vibration that old stone conducted over distance. Someone below them was moving with purpose and numbers. Cassian was at the stair's head. Kael behind her. She was between them, which was not where she would have chosen to be, but this was not a moment to negotiate positioning. "The kitchen," she said. "The same way we came." "If they're on the second level," Orion started. "We go through, not around," she said. "Fast, before they seal the kitchen exit." Cassian went down the stair. She followed. Kael's hand touched her shoulder once. Light, brief, the touch of a man steadying someone on a narrow stair in the dark, purely functional. And then the stair opened onto the kitchen level, and the kitchen was not what it had been. The kitchen staff were gone. All of them. The hearths were still burning, the food still in its various states of preparation, but the room was empty of its people, which meant the staff had been cleared by someone who knew what was coming and had cleared them to keep them from being in it, which meant either Aldrich's people had enough organizational control of this building to manage its staff, or someone else had done the clearing. She didn't have time to determine which. The wooden door to the stable yard was 30 feet away. She counted doorways as they crossed the kitchen. 1, 2, a serving hatch, a pantry entrance, and she was at 25 feet from the wooden door when the door to the formal corridor opened and 4 men came through it. Not Aldrich's men. Lucien. He was in the lead, and behind him were 3 court officials, and he looked at her across the kitchen with an expression she had not seen from him all evening. Not the composure, not the calculation, not the carefully managed authority of a crown heir managing a room. Something stripped of all of those. He looked, she thought, like a man who had made a decision very recently and was still inhabiting the feeling of having made it. "The east exit is covered," he said. "The south wall isn't." She looked at him. "Aldrich's people don't know the south wall access," he said. "I do. The door is 30 feet from the stable yard's south edge." He held her gaze. "The horses are at the south wall. I had your man move them 4 minutes ago." Orion, she thought. He'd been reached by Lucien, or Lucien had found him. She looked at Lucien across the kitchen with its empty hearths and its burning fires, and the particular unreality of a room designed for organized domestic production that had been repurposed in the last 30 minutes into something else. She thought about 2 years of waiting that he'd known about and not addressed. She thought about the petition filed to protect himself. She thought about the calculation that had run behind his eyes all evening. She thought about a man who had spent his entire political career building things, and who was standing in a palace kitchen at midnight, holding open a door he didn't have to open, because she was not sure why. Because it was right. Because the alternative was something he couldn't tolerate in himself. Because some version of who he'd been by a copper river still existed underneath everything the court had built over it. She didn't know which. It didn't change the door. "Why?" she said. "Because I owe you something I can't give back," he said. "This is what I have instead." She crossed the kitchen and went through the door he was holding. The south wall access was exactly where he'd said. Narrow, functional, the door that deliveries used, the door that didn't appear on the formal architectural plans of the palace's public spaces. Cassian went through first, then Kael. Then she stepped through into the night air, and the cold and the smell of horses, and she heard from behind her, somewhere in the palace's interior, the sound of organized movement reaching the kitchen level. Too slow. The horses were at the south wall. Orion was there. The Ravaryn men from the second level were there. 2 of them, the other 2. She didn't ask. Cassian was already at the nearest horse. He looked at her across the animal's neck, and the moonlight was enough to see by, and his face was everything she'd read across this long, impossible evening. The steadiness, the cost, the cut on his cheekbone that had finally stopped bleeding, the left shoulder he was holding fractionally higher than the right, the rib that had taken the hit in the storeroom. A man at the end of a very long night who was still exactly who he'd been at the beginning of it. "The South Road," he said, 3 hours to the border. After the border, we're in Southern territory." She looked at the horse. She looked at the palace wall above her with its lit windows and the shadows moving behind them. She looked at the paper folded against her sternum, the note from the gallery, her mother's writing on the outer fold of the letters. And she thought about what the next 3 hours meant, and what the border meant, and what came after the border. She thought, on the other side of that border is a version of my life I don't know yet. She thought, every version of my life I've known so far was built on a foundation someone else laid without telling me. She thought, the next one is mine. She put her foot in the stirrup, and from above, from the palace's upper window, the window of a room she hadn't been in, a window she hadn't known to watch, a torch signal came. 3 flashes. Deliberate. Repeated. Cale saw it. His head came up. That's not Aldrich's pattern, he said. That's an imperial signal. Cassian looked at the window. His face had gone very still in the way of a man whose mind is moving fast underneath a surface that has stopped. It's a summons, he said. From who? Orion said. Cassian was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Seraphina, and his expression carried for the first time all evening something that was not controlled, something that was not steady, something that she could not immediately name, but that had the quality of a man confronting a fact he had been managing around for a very long time and had just run out of space to keep managing. There's a thing I haven't told you, he said. She looked at him. The torch in the window flashed again, 3 times. The same pattern. The person who submitted that testimony, he said. The anonymous intermediary. The sealed letters. She waited. I didn't submit it, he said. But I knew who would. I've known for 6 months. He held her gaze with the specific quality of a man who is done managing the timeline of what someone else knows. The signal from that window belongs to the only person alive who knew where your mother's letters were kept. The only person your mother trusted with the location when she wrote them. She looked at the window. She looked at the signal. She looked at Cassian. Your mother had one contact, he said. One person she wrote to in the years after Vestmere, in code, using a channel Aldrich's network never penetrated. One person who has been watching you. Watching both of us. Watching this entire situation for longer than I have. The torch flashed a 4th time. She thought, the floor is tilting again. She thought, it has not stopped tilting since the moment I walked into that hall. Who? She said. He looked at the window. He looked at her. He said the name. The name hung in the cold air of the stable yard like smoke after a fire, present, dispersing, impossible to call back. Seraphina stood with one foot in the stirrup, and the night around her and the torch in the upper window still burning, and she looked at Cassian, and she said, say it again. Councillor Vera, he said. She served the Eastern Reach under your mother's dynasty. She was 17 when the consolidation happened. She's been on the Auric Crown Council for 31 years. She thought about the chamber, the 4 council members at the table. She thought about the one she hadn't focused on. Not Adrava, not the careful-eyed young man. The 4th one, older than Adrava, with the kind of face that had been carefully unremarkable for a very long time. The face of a woman who had made a professional study of not being the person that rooms remembered. She thought, I looked right at her. She thought, she let me. She's been inside the Dominion's council for 3 decades, Seraphina said. Working for what? For my mother's memory, for a bloodline she watched get buried. For the possibility of you, Cassian said. Yes. The torch flashed again. 4 times now. The pattern was patient, but it was not indefinite. She understood instinctively that the signal had a window, that the window was closing, and that what she did with the next 60 seconds would determine whether she walked into whatever Councillor Vera was offering or rode south without it. She took her foot out of the stirrup. Cale made a small sound. Not protest. More the sound of a man updating his operational expectations. 3 minutes, she said. I go alone. You don't, Cassian said. I go with you, she said. The rest wait here. He held her gaze. She could see him calculate the risk, the time, the unknown quantity of what Vira wanted, and she could see him reach the end of the calculation and find that the answer was the same one he'd been arriving at all evening. He went with her. The door back into the palace was still unlocked. Lucien's door, the delivery entrance, and she noted with the corner of her mind that Lucien was not in the stable yard anymore. Had not been since she'd come through, had opened a door and stepped back and disappeared in the way of a man who had given what he had to give and was done being in the scene. She would think about Lucian later. There was a great deal she would think about later. Later was a place she was building toward and had not yet arrived in. Third level. The stairs she and Cassian had used when they went for Kael. She went up it faster than before, without the shoes this time. Her bare feet on the stone, and the cold was sharp and she registered it and moved anyway. The window that had signaled was on the north corridor. She'd mapped it from outside, counted windows from the corner, and she moved through the third level dark with the counting still running in her head. North corridor, fifth door. Light came from under it. Not the full bleed of a torch, but the filtered presence of something smaller, more controlled. She knocked. The door opened. Counselor Vera was smaller than she'd looked at the council table. This was, Seraphina thought, what the table had done for her. Given her a horizontal authority, a surface between herself and the room that added dimension. Without it, she was a slight woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair and the hands of someone who had spent decades handling documents and the eyes of someone who had spent the same decades handling considerably more than documents. She stepped back to let them in. The room was a storeroom, like the one where they'd found Kael, but different in its specific contents. This one had been used for something organized. A small table, 2 chairs, a lantern turned to its lowest setting, a leather satchel on the table that was worn at the handles in a way that suggested years rather than months. Vera looked at Seraphina with the quality of someone who has been looking forward to a meeting for a very long time and is now in it and finding that the reality of the meeting is both more and less than the anticipation. "You have her hands," Vera said, "the same shape." Seraphina looked at her own hands. She was still holding her shoes. She'd carried them up the stair without thinking. She looked at Vera's face. "You loved her," she said. "She was my queen," Vera said, "and my closest friend. In that order for a long time, and then, eventually, reversed." She said it with the flatness of long practice, the way people talked about grief they'd been living with for decades, not as a wound anymore, but as a settled part of the interior geography. "I was there when she named you. I was there when Aldrich's men came. I was not there when she died. That has taken me a long time to make peace with." The room was quiet. Outside, somewhere in the palace below, the organized movement she'd felt earlier was still happening, but distant now, separated from this space by stone and height, and the specific stillness of a room that had been deliberately prepared for a conversation. "You submitted the testimony," Seraphina said. "I have been waiting," Vera said, "for the right moment for 40 years. Tonight was the right moment." She paused. "I'm sorry it was also one of the worst nights of your life." "It was both," Seraphina said. "Yes. That's how these things tend to work." Vera pulled the leather satchel toward her across the table. "There are things in here that are yours. Not the letters. You have those. Other things. Your mother's seal. The original land grants of the Sylvain Eastern Reach. A sworn statement from 6 witnesses to the consolidation proceedings, describing what Aldrich's office destroyed and what they concealed." She met Seraphina's gaze. "The Eastern Reach is not gone. It was hidden. There's a difference." Seraphina thought about her mother's hands in winter, the way she'd held books, the word explicit in the Vestmere Square and where it had come from, that particular word, from a woman educated in a dynasty's court and then given a new name and a leaking roof and a frontier province and 40 years of silence. "What do you want from me?" she said. "For this." Vera looked at her steadily. "Nothing," she said. "Your mother asked me to keep these safe until you could use them. That's all I was ever doing." It was the answer Seraphina had not expected, and therefore the one she trusted most. She took the satchel. The weight of it was not what she expected either. Not heavy, not dramatically substantial. The kind of weight that didn't account for what it contained. A dynasty in a leather bag. 40 years of hidden history and something you could carry with one hand. She thought, my mother carried this too. In a different form. Every day. In silence. The thing in her chest that she hadn't had time to sit with, the thing she'd pressed her palm against and moved away from and filed for later, arrived now, with the specific insistence of things that have been deferred past the point where deferral was serving any useful purpose. She sat down in one of the chairs. Not because she planned to, because her body made the decision before her mind confirmed it, which was, she had learned, often the most accurate form of decision-making available. Vera sat in the other chair. Cassian remained standing near the door, and she was aware of him the way she'd been aware of him all evening. As a steady presence at the edge of the frame, not inserting himself, not withdrawing, simply there with the quality of something that had decided where it was and had no argument with that decision. "She didn't tell me anything," Seraphina said. Her voice was level. It cost her something to keep it level. "My whole life, she didn't tell me anything." "No," Vera said. "Why?" Vera was quiet for a moment. The lantern did what lanterns did, made the light feel enclosed, personal, the kind of light that made a small room feel separate from everything outside it. "Because she was afraid," Vera said. Not of what Aldrich would do. She'd already survived what Aldrich could do. She was afraid that if she told you what you were, you'd spend your whole life trying to be it. And she'd watched what that cost the people who tried. She paused. She wanted you to become yourself first, before you knew about any of this. Seraphina sat with that. Sat. She thought about whether she was angry about it. She explored the interior of that question with the careful attention she'd been applying all evening to things that deserved careful attention. She found anger there. Old anger with the particular quality of something that had been compressed for a very long time under layers of other things. The anger of a girl who grew up not understanding the shape of what she'd lost because she hadn't known she'd lost it. The anger of 24 years of frontier survival that might have been something different, in a different context, or might not, or might have been exactly what it needed to be, and she just hadn't known why. She found grief there too. The 11-year-old at the frozen grave, standing in the cold, thinking she understood what she was losing. She had not understood. She would need a long time to understand. "All right," she said, not to Vera specifically, to the room, to the night, to the version of herself that had walked into the Grand Meridian Hall hours ago, wearing glass beads in a future that had already been canceled before she arrived. She stood. She picked up the satchel. She looked at Vera. "Come south," she said, "when you can do it safely. There are things in that satchel I don't have the context for, and you do." Vera looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in the older woman's face that Seraphina didn't try to name. It was too private, too long in the making, the kind of expression that belonged to a person who had been carrying something for 40 years and had just felt the weight distribute differently. "Yes," she said, "I'll come south." Seraphina walked to the door. Cassian opened it. They went down the stair for the last time, through the kitchen and its empty hearths and its burning fires, out the wooden door into the stable yard and the cold night air. And she did not look back at the palace, and she did not slow her stride, and she did not let herself feel the full weight of the satchel in her hand until they reached the south wall, and the horses and Orion's carefully neutral expression, and Kael's complete absence of expression, which was, she now understood, its own form of eloquence. They rode south before the next hour turned. The city fell away behind them, and then the city's outskirts, and then the last formal markers of the Auric Dominion's capital district. And then they were on the south road with the sky beginning to change at its very furthest edge, and 4 hours of riding between them and the border. And she rode without speaking, with the satchel across her saddle and the letters against her sternum, and the glass beads in her hem, catching the cold starlight in the way that Ilara had planned for an entirely different evening. Ilara. She would send for Ilara tomorrow. She would send the fastest rider Cassian had. And she would ask, not instruct, because the asking mattered. And she would tell Ilara everything in the letter she would write on the other side of the border, in whatever room became the first room of the next version of her life. And she would leave space in the letter for Ilara to decide what she wanted to do with the information. Because that was what you did for the people you loved when you understood what it cost to have decisions made for you without your knowledge. The sky kept changing, black to deep blue to the first suggestion of something lighter at the rim. At some point in the second hour of riding, Cassian moved his horse alongside hers. Not crowding, just alongside. They rode without speaking for another mile. The road was good, well-maintained, the kind of road that existed because it connected things that powerful people needed connected. And the horses were steady, and the night was still except for the sound of hooves and the wind moving through the open country on either side. "She named you Seraphina," he said eventually. "Yes." "It was the name of the first Sylvan queen," he said, 4 generations before her. She had not known that. She absorbed it, added it to the growing structure of what she didn't know, and was in the process of learning she didn't know, which was a different architecture from the one she'd been living in yesterday. Yesterday she'd known what she'd lost. Today she was beginning to understand the shape of what there was to find. "You knew about the Sylvain name," she said. "I know Sylvain history," he said. "The Southern Empire has always tracked the outer dynasties. Old habit. And when you heard my name in Vesmir," he was quiet for a moment. "It was one of the things that made me look twice," he said. "I didn't know what it meant then. I had a suspicion. I kept it." She thought about 18 months of a king keeping a suspicion, watching a woman in a frontier square, sending careful inquiries through channels he didn't advertise, arriving at a gala on the night that suspicion resolved into something larger than he'd managed it. "You could have told me," she said, "when you suspected." "Yes," he said. "You chose not to." "I chose to wait until I was certain," he said, "and then I chose to let the information arrive in a form that gave you the full version rather than my partial one." He paused. "I'm telling you this because I said I'd be accurate, not charitable. That's what I did. I can tell you it came from caution rather than calculation, but you'll have to decide what you make of that." She rode beside him and thought about the difference between caution and calculation, and whether, from the inside of a decision, a person could always tell which one they were acting from. She thought about her mother making the same distinction, or not making it, or making it in a way that prioritized Seraphina's future over Seraphina's present knowledge, and whether that was love or strategy. She had asked that question in the council chamber, and she had not answered it. She was beginning to think the answer was both, and the both was the point. That the most consequential decisions made by people who loved other people existed in the space where love and strategy became the same motion, and the inability to separate them wasn't a failure of honesty, but evidence of how completely one person's life had become wrapped around another's. Her mother had built her for survival, had given her the tools without the context, had given her the frontier hardness and the careful reading of rooms and the ability to stand still under attention, had given her all of it without once saying, "This is what you are, this is what you carry, this is the weight you were born into." And the result was a woman who had walked into the Grand Meridian Hall in glass beads and survived the worst night of her recent life, and walked out the other side with her mother's letters against her heart, and a deposed dynasty in a leather bag and a king riding beside her who had told her the truth about himself even when the truth was not flattering. She thought, my mother knew what she was doing. She thought, I'm angry about it and I understand it, and those two things can both be true. She thought, that is the most adult thought I've had in my life. The border came 2 hours before full dawn. It was marked simply, a stone pillar on each side of the road with the Southern Empire's crest carved into the facing side, worn by weather but readable. The horses crossed it without ceremony. The road did not change. The air did not change. The sky did not change. But something in the quality of the space around them shifted, and she felt it physically, in the specific way of a person who has been in a state of heightened alertness for many hours and feels the alertness modify when the environment does. Not gone, not safe yet. Safety was a longer project than one border crossing, but different. The particular quality of different that comes when you have moved from someone else's ground to your own, or to the ground of someone who has made you an offer. She stopped her horse at the pillar. The others stopped around her. She looked at the crest on the stone. The Southern Empire's mark, 3 interlocking rings beneath a crown, the symbology of alliance and continuity, and the particular ambition of a dynasty that had been building for 8 generations. She looked at Cassian. He was watching her with the same attention he'd had in the corridor, on the floor, on one knee in the hall. The attention that read what it found rather than what it wanted to find, and was willing to receive either. I have a thing to say to you, she said, before we go further. Yes, he said. I'm not going south because of the right, she said. The right's outcome is something I'll address with the council when there's time to address it properly. I'm not going because of the bloodline or the satchel or because Aldrich's people are behind us and you have 300,000 soldiers ahead of us. Those are all real things. They're not the reason. He waited. I'm going because of what you said in the corridor, she said, about wanting to see what I build when I'm not managing a crisis. That's the only version of what you've offered that I trust enough to move toward. She held his gaze. I want you to understand that, so we don't have a misunderstanding later about what I agreed to tonight." "I understand it," he said. "And I want you to know," she said, "that I'm arriving with nothing settled. My head is not settled about my mother, about the bloodline, about what the Eastern Reach means or what I'm supposed to do with it. My head is not settled about you. I'm arriving in the middle of those things, not at the end of them. And if that changes what the offer looks like—" "It doesn't," he said. "You don't have to answer that fast." "I'm not answering fast," he said. "I've thought about it for 18 months. The version of you I'm interested in is the one that arrives with things unsettled. I've had enough of people who've settled everything before they walk into the room. They're usually settling for less than they're worth." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought, "I have been in this man's presence for one evening." She thought, "I have read him more clearly than I read Lucian in 3 years." She thought, "That is either the best argument for going south or the most dangerous one. And the fact that I can't tell the difference is information about where I am right now, which is at the beginning, not the middle, not anywhere near the end." "All right," she said. She looked at Kyle. "Thank you for not asking questions when I said we were going back for you." Kyle looked at her. "You came back," he said, "for the second time. The same words as in the storeroom, the same weight." "Yes," she said. "That's the only answer I needed," he said. She looked at Orion. Orion was looking at the sky, already lighter now at the southern horizon, the first real suggestion of dawn coming up ahead of them rather than behind. He glanced at her with the precise lateral attention of a man who processes his surroundings while appearing to look elsewhere. "You're going to want to sleep at some point," he said. "You look like you haven't in a while." "I haven't," she said. "It's been a long night." "They tend to be," he said. "The ones worth having." She pressed her heels to the horses' sides. They rode south into the opening dark. The hours that followed had the particular quality of transition, not the crisis hours, not the charged and watchful hours of the palace, but the hours on the other side of crisis, when the body is still running on what got it through and the mind is beginning, slowly and unevenly, to catch up with everything that happened. She thought about Alara. She thought about the dress with the glass beads, which she was still wearing, which had ridden 4 hours south from the capital, still doing what it had been built to do, catching light, throwing it back, making a frontier woman visible in rooms designed to exclude her. She thought about 3 weeks of Alara's evenings at a small table near a window, pulling thread through tiny holes, pressing the heel of her hand against her lower back. She thought about the specific kind of love that makes things for other people without telling them what the things cost. She thought, Alara is going to have a great deal to say about tonight. She thought, I'm going to let her say all of it. At the 3rd hour past the border, with the dawn fully arrived, and the south road cutting through country that was different from the Dominion's terrain, wider open, more sky, the land doing something flatter and more extensive that felt like room rather than exposure, they stopped at a way station to water the horses, and she sat on the station's stone bench with the leather satchel across her knees, and she opened it. She took out her mother's seal first. It was small. Silver, she thought, or something close to it, worn at the handle in the way of something used regularly for years and then not used at all. The crest on its face was the Sylvain mark. She could see the design without knowing its name, could see that it was old and specific and belonged to a thing larger than a frontier province in a leaking house. She held it in her palm. She thought about her mother holding it, turning it over, making the decision, at some point, to stop using it and start hiding it and eventually put it in a satchel and give the satchel to a 17-year-old girl named Vaira and say, keep this until she can use it. She had been 4 years old when her mother made that decision. She had no memory of it. She had been learning to walk on a different floor, in a different house, not knowing that in a different room the architecture of the rest of her life was being quietly assembled by hands that loved her. She closed her fingers around the seal. She put it back in the satchel. She took out the letters. 9 folded pages in her mother's handwriting. She had not read them yet, had not had a moment that was the right moment, had been moving too fast and then moving at all. And now here in the flat open country of the southern border in the full morning light, with the horses drinking and Orion checking something on the road ahead, and Kyle sitting against the far wall of the way station with his eyes closed and his arms resting on his knees in the particular rest posture of a man who can sleep in any position and anywhere. Now she had a moment. She opened the first letter. The date at the top was 31 years ago. She had not been born yet. Her mother was writing to Vera from Vestmere 6 years after the consolidation, in the cramped, precise handwriting of someone who had been educated to write a larger hand and had trained herself out of it because a large hand attracted a different kind of attention. She read all 9 letters, in order, sitting on a stone bench in the morning light, and she did not allow herself to stop between them or to put them down or to do any of the things that a person does when reading becomes painful and they need to set it aside for a moment. Her mother had been afraid. That was the first thing. Not in the way of someone paralyzed. Her mother's fear had been the productive kind, the kind that organized itself into planning and contingency and the careful management of risk across decades. But afraid. A 17-year-old girl who had been a queen for 11 months before Aldrich's consolidation had taken everything, hidden in a province at the edge of an empire that had forgotten she existed, raising 2 daughters and a leaking roof, and a silence she maintained every day for the rest of her life. The letters to Vera were the only place the silence broke. She wrote about Seraphina the way people wrote about things they were building from the ground up, and were not certain would survive the building. She wrote, "She is stubborn in a way that scares me and makes me proud in equal measure, and I don't know yet if that's my blood, or the frontier, or just her." She wrote, "She got up on the grain store roof today and fixed the patch I couldn't reach. And she's 8 years old, and I didn't tell her to, and she didn't ask permission." She wrote, "I keep waiting to tell her, and I keep finding reasons not to, and I'm beginning to understand that the reasons are not really reasons, they are fear, and I'm trying to figure out how to be honest with myself about that." She wrote in the last letter, which was dated 18 months before her death, "I don't know how much longer I have. Something in my chest has been wrong since winter. I haven't told the girls. I'm not ready yet. But I've been thinking about what I want Seraphina to know when the time comes. And I keep arriving at the same place, which is this. I want her to know that everything I hid from her was not about what I thought she couldn't handle. It was about what I couldn't bear to watch her carry before she was ready for the weight. She's going to be ready before I think she is. She always is. She always has been." She put the last letter down on her knees. The morning was fully bright around her, and the horses had finished drinking, and somewhere behind her Cassian was there. She had not looked, but she knew she had been knowing where he was all morning with the specific awareness of someone who has calibrated to another person's presence without deciding to. She thought, my mother wrote that 18 months before she died. She thought, 18 months before her mother wrote that letter, Cassian Ravaryn had been in Vestmere watching a woman on a roof fix a patch she hadn't been told to fix and hadn't asked permission for. She did not know what to do with that. She filed it in the place where she put things that were too large for the current moment and needed more room than she presently had. She folded the letters. She put them back. She heard his footstep behind her. She recognized it now, the specific weight and pace of it. And then he sat beside her on the bench, not close, leaving space, the space of a man who has some understanding of when proximity is what's needed and when it isn't. "All 9? He said. "Yes." "How are you?" She thought about the question. She gave it the consideration it deserved rather than the consideration that would have been easier. "I'm at the beginning of how I am," she said. "The full version is going to take longer than this morning." "Yes," he said. "She was afraid," she said. "My mother. She was afraid the whole time. I didn't know that. I thought She was so contained. Every memory I have of her is contained. I thought that meant she wasn't afraid. It meant she was afraid and had decided that containing it was more useful than showing it." "That's a distinction worth knowing," he said. "I've been doing the same thing," she said, "my whole life. I thought it was just how I was built." She looked at the satchel on her knees. "Maybe it's how she built me." "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it's how you built yourself, with materials she gave you. Those aren't the same thing." She looked at him. He was looking ahead, at the road, at the open country, at whatever his particular version of the horizon looked like from inside the kind of life he'd had. He had a profile that was easier to read than his full face, or maybe she had just gotten better at reading it across one long night. "You have things you're afraid of," she said. "Yes." "Tell me one." He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question, considering how to answer it accurately. "Getting it wrong," he said. "The empire. The decisions. The weight of what 300,000 people need from a man who is making his best guesses under incomplete information at all times, the same as everyone else, only with more consequences if the guess is wrong. He paused. And losing the people who matter. I've had some experience of that. It doesn't get easier with practice. She thought about a king who traveled without announcement to see what people were when they thought no one important was watching. She thought about the kind of loneliness that produced that habit, not the loneliness of isolation, which could be addressed by proximity, but the loneliness of a person in the center of many things who had not found in any of those things the particular quality of being seen accurately rather than charitably. I'm going to make mistakes, she said. In the South, I don't know your court or your people or your institutions or the 12,000 things I'd need to know to navigate any of it without making mistakes. Yes, he said. And when I make mistakes, I'm going to need you to tell me directly, not manage me toward an understanding, not time the information for when you think I'm ready. She held his gaze. Directly. I'll try, he said. I'll fail at it sometimes. I've spent a long time in the habit of managing information strategically, and it's not something that disappears because I've decided it should. I know, she said. I'll tell you when you're doing it. You can tell me when I'm containing something that should be said out loud. He looked at her. That's a more even arrangement than most people would accept. I'm not most people, she said. No, he said. You're not. The quality of the morning had changed. Fully bright now, the kind of clean early light that made the world look like it had been recently built, which was perhaps what mornings were for. The psychological utility of a light that reset the visual record back to something manageable. She thought about the Grand Meridian Hall in that light, how it would look this morning, emptied of its gala, cleaned of its candles, the marble floor swept of whatever the rite had left on it. She thought about Adrava locking documents into places Aldrich's network couldn't access. She thought about Lucian waking in the capital with the weight of a night that had not gone the way any version of his planning had anticipated. She thought about what came next. Not all of it. All of it was too large for this bench, for this morning, for the current capacity of a woman who had been awake for most of the last 24 hours and was sitting with her dead mother's letters and a deposed dynasty's founding documents and a future that had been rebuilt 3 times before noon. Just the next piece. The Eastern Reach, she said. The land grants in the satchel. What do they actually mean? Cassian considered this with the seriousness of a man who understood that the question was not hypothetical. They mean the Selvan claim to the Eastern Reach was never legally extinguished, he said. Aldrich's consolidation removed it from the imperial record, but removal from record is not the same as dissolution of claim. With the documentation Vera preserved, if it's what you say it is, you could challenge the territorial authority the Aldrich family has held for 40 years. Which would challenge Lucian's engagement, she said. Which would challenge the political foundation of the engagement, he said. Yes. I'm not doing it for that reason, she said. I want to be clear about that. I know, he said. I'm doing it. She stopped. She examined what she was about to say and found it was true. I'm doing it because my mother spent 40 years in a leaking house maintaining a silence that cost her everything, and she did it to keep me safe. And the people who put her there and kept her there have been profiting from that silence for 4 decades, and no one has asked them to account for it. He nodded, the simple nod of a man who has heard something he agrees with completely and sees no reason to add to it. It will be complicated, she said. Yes. It will take time. Yes. And it will require. She thought about Adrava, about Vera, about the council and the Dominion's legal architecture and the specific complexity of challenging an institutional arrangement that had been in place for 40 years. More than I have right now. Yes, he said, but not more than you'll have. You're going to have resources in the South that you didn't have in Vestmere. People who know the legal frameworks, access to channels that weren't available to a frontier woman. He paused. And time. Not all problems have to be solved this week. She thought about this. The specific relief of it, not that the problems weren't real, they were entirely real, but that they were not all due at once, that the urgency of the night behind her did not have to extend indefinitely forward. She had been in crisis management mode since she walked into the Grand Meridian Hall. Before that, In some form, she had been in crisis management mode her entire life. The leaking roof, the frontier winter, the waiting. She thought, what does it feel like to not be managing a crisis? She thought, I don't know. She thought, maybe that's the thing I'm going south to find out. She stood up. She held the satchel in one hand and looked at the open country around the way station, the flat southern land going out to a horizon that was further away than any horizon she'd seen from Vestmere, where the mountains broke the view and made the world feel like a series of contained spaces. Here it was open. The world went further than she could see from where she stood and kept going after that. One more thing, she said. Cassian stood beside her. Last night, the hall, when you knelt. Yes, he said. Was it? I've been trying to figure out if it was a political move, she said, done in front of witnesses, in front of the Empire, whether the kneeling was for them or for me. He looked at her steadily. It was for you, he said. The audience was incidental. I would have asked the same question with no one watching. You can't know that, she said. You've never been in an empty room with me. Something moved in his face. No, he said. You're right. I can't know that with certainty. What I can tell you is that when I went to my knee, I was not thinking about the witnesses. I was thinking about whether you would say yes. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought one evening, one long impossible evening that started with a broken promise and a glass-beaded dress, and ended here, at a way station on the southern road, with a deposed dynasty in a leather bag and a king telling her he'd been thinking about whether she'd say yes. She had not said yes. The window had closed before the answer could be given. The counselor's signal had intervened, and the evening had run its course into escape and riding and dawn, and the border stone with its interlocking rings. The answer was still pending, technically. The right was still, in some formal sense, unresolved. She thought, I am at the beginning of something. She thought, the beginning is not the place to settle the ending. When we reach the south, she said, and I've slept, and I've read the rest of what's in that satchel, and Alara has said everything she needs to say about this night, and I've had time to think without anyone in the building needing something from me. She held his gaze. Ask me again. He held her gaze in return. The steadiness of a man who had waited 18 months and understood that waiting was not losing ground. Yes, he said. They walked to the horses. Orion fell into place beside his brother with the natural ease of a man returning to his preferred position. Kael appeared from his resting spot at the way station wall with the specific, unhurried readiness of a man who had not actually been asleep, but had been very efficiently using the time for something internal. They rode. The south road opened ahead of them into country that was wider and more light-filled than anything she'd seen from the back of a horse, and the morning kept arriving in the way mornings did, steadily, without announcement, the light changing and the air warming, and the world incrementally becoming more visible, more specific, more itself. She rode with the satchel across her saddle and her mother's letters against her sternum and the glass beads in her hem and the cold feel of the morning air against her face, and she thought about all of it. The hall, the right, Vera's lantern, the corridor, the kitchen, the stable yard, the south road, the border stone. And she let herself think about it without needing it to resolve yet, without needing the thinking to arrive anywhere in particular. She was 24 years old. She had been built for harder situations than she'd known she was being built for, by hands that loved her more than they'd been able to say. She was riding south into a life she hadn't planned for. She had a great deal to learn. She was not afraid of the learning. That was enough. That was, she thought, with the particular quality of a truth that arrived in the body before the mind confirmed it, that settled into the chest with the steadiness of something that intended to stay, more than enough. The horizon ahead was further than she could see and kept going after that. And she rode toward it with her shoulders level and her chin up and the morning coming in around her from every direction, and for the first time in her life she did not need to know what was at the end of the road to feel certain that the road was worth taking. She rode. The Empire fell away behind her. The south opened ahead. And Seraphina Vale, last heir of the Sylvain line, daughter of a hidden queen, woman of the frontier, survivor of the worst and best night of her life, rode into the morning as herself, fully and finally, and without apology, for the first time.